She's too big for this ranch." Someone said it loud enough for Clara to hear right there on the platform. She didn't flinch. She picked up her suitcase and walked straight toward the man who hadn't moved one step to meet her. The man who had sent for a wife and was now standing there with disappointment written across every inch of his face. Ethan Caldwell looked at the woman stepping off that train and felt his stomach drop. She looked back at him and said quietly with complete steadiness, "I know you didn't expect me, but your cattle are dying and I know why. Let's talk about that first." If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The platform at Harlow Station was never a quiet place on a Tuesday morning, but the crowd that gathered that particular August day in 1882 was not there for the supply wagon or the mail delivery. Word had spread the way. Word always spread in a small Montana Territory town, fast exaggerated and completely impossible to stop. Ethan Caldwell was getting his mail-order bride today. Ethan stood at the far end of the platform with his hat pulled low and his jaw set, the way it always was when he was trying not to show what he was feeling. He was a tall man, lean from years of working land that fought back harder every season, with hands that were cracked at the knuckles and a face that had been weathered into something between 40 and ancient. He was 38. He felt 60. Behind him, half the town pretended to have somewhere to be. Pete Donovan leaned against the grain store wall with a coffee tin in his hand and didn't even try to hide the fact that he was watching. Margaret Hale had positioned herself near the post office with her daughter Ruth, and both of them had the look of women who had already decided something without knowing a single fact. The sheriff's deputy, a young man named Colby, sat on a fence post and tilted his head each time the train whistle sounded in the distance. Nobody said anything to Ethan directly. They didn't have to. He could feel every single one of them. "She's going to be some city woman who can't lift a bucket." Pete had said the week before, not to Ethan, but within earshot of him, which was the same thing. What kind of woman signs up for that arrangement anyway? You think she knows what she's getting herself into? Ethan had walked away without answering. He had no good answer. The truth was that he had reached out to the Northern Frontier Marriage Agency 6 weeks ago in a moment of something that wasn't quite desperation, but was close enough that it frightened him. 6 cattle dead, the creek running low, 3 fence sections down along the eastern slope, and no money to hire anyone to fix them. His foreman, a man named Dutch, who had worked Caldwell Ranch for 11 years, had taken his wages and left in May when it became clear there were no wages left to take. Ethan had sat at his kitchen table on a Sunday night with every bill spread out in front of him and finally said out loud to the empty room what he had been refusing to say for 2 years. "I cannot do this alone." The agency had been his father's suggestion, offered in a letter from a hospital bed in Bozeman, where his father was spending what everyone agreed were probably his last months. Not because romance was important, his father had written, but because a ranch needed 2 people to survive. Because isolation was its own kind of death. Because the land doesn't care how proud you are. Ethan had read that letter 4 times. Then he had written to the agency. He hadn't asked for a particular kind of woman. He hadn't described what he wanted or expected. He had written only that he needed someone capable, someone honest, and someone who understood that what he was offering was work and partnership, and a home that needed saving, not a comfortable life or an easy future. The agency had sent back one name, Clara Whitman. 25 years old. From a small town outside of Nashville, Tennessee. No family remaining. Agricultural background. Described herself in her own words as practical, hardworking, and unafraid of difficulty. Ethan had not asked for a photograph. He realized now, standing on this platform with half the town behind him, that that had been either the most honest or the most foolish decision he'd ever made. The train came around the mountain curve, with its whistle singing and its wheels throwing up that particular smell of hot iron and coal smoke that always made Ethan think of things leaving and things arriving. He straightened without meaning to. His hands found his belt and stayed there. The train slowed. The doors opened. 3 men stepped off first. Then a woman with 2 children who ran straight for the man waiting with his arms open. Then a traveling salesman type with a sample case and a hat that was too fine for Harlow. Then Clara Whitman stepped onto this platform. And the silence that fell over that crowd was the loudest thing Ethan had heard in years. She was not what anyone expected. That was the only way to say it that came close to honest. Clara Whitman was a full-figured woman, round, in the way that spoke of a body that had lived and worked and eaten real food, not the pinched silhouette that was fashionable in the Eastern illustrated papers. Her dress was plain dark blue cotton, worn soft at the elbows, and her hair was pulled back in a practical knot that had survived the train journey better than most things that traveled that far. She carried a battered leather suitcase in one hand and had a small brown notebook tucked under her other arm, with the possessive grip of someone who had carried it for years. She was not tall. She was not what the dime novels called willowy or delicate or any of those words. But she stepped off that train and looked down the length of that platform with brown eyes that didn't flinch at a single thing they saw, and there was something in that look that Ethan couldn't immediately name. He stepped forward because there was nothing else to do. "Miss Whitman," he said. She looked at him directly. "Mr. Caldwell." Behind him, he heard Pete Donovan say something low and quick to the man beside him, and then he heard two people laugh, and the sound was quiet enough that Clara probably couldn't hear the words, but nobody with eyes could have missed that it happened. Clara heard the laugh. Her jaw moved, once the way a jaw moves when a person is pressing something down that they refuse to release. And then her expression settled back into something even and composed, and she looked back at Ethan without giving the crowd behind him another glance. "I'm sorry for the state of the journey," she said. "The train from Billings was delayed 4 hours. I hope I haven't inconvenienced your schedule." "No schedule to inconvenience," Ethan said. It wasn't the warmest thing he could have said. He was aware of that the moment it came out. But he was standing in front of a woman who was nothing like what he'd pictured, and his cattle were dying, and the whole town was watching him. And warmth was not a resource he had a great deal of left. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, as if she had already calculated something, and filed the result away. "All right," she said. "Shall we go?" The wagon ride out to Caldwell Ranch took 40 minutes through country that was beautiful, the way drought-stricken land could still be beautiful. All that space and silence, and the mountains sitting blue and enormous at the edge of everything. Ethan drove. Clara sat beside him and looked out at the land with an attention that was not the attention of a tourist. She wasn't admiring it, she was reading it. "When did the rain stop?" she asked about 20 minutes out. Ethan glanced at her. "Spring. We got a hard week in April, and then nothing." "What are you running on the range right now?" 23 head, was 31 at the start of the year. She didn't react to that the way he expected. She didn't make a sympathetic noise or ask what happened. She just looked out at the landscape and said, "How far is your main water source from where they graze?" Ethan frowned. "Quarter mile, maybe. There's a creek that runs off the north slope." "Why? What's the creek look like?" "What do you mean? What does it look like?" "The banks," she said. "The plant growth around it. Has it changed in the last year or two?" He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which was something he hadn't done with regard to that creek specifically, because the creek had always just been the creek. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't walk that section much anymore. Dutch used to check it." Clara nodded again and made a small note in her notebook with a pencil stub she produced from her dress pocket. Ethan watched her do it and felt something strange, not irritation exactly, but a kind of off-balance feeling, like a man who expects a step to be there and finds empty air instead. "You know something about cattle ranching," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "My grandmother kept animals," Clara said, not looking up from the notebook. "Not cattle mostly, but she taught me enough about the way land and water and animals connect that I know what to look for when things go wrong." "And you think something's wrong with my water?" "I think it's worth looking at before we assume it's just drought." She tucked the notebook back under her arm. "May I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The cattle that died. Did they die quickly or slowly?" Ethan stared at the trail ahead. "Slow. Over 2 or 3 days each. They'd stop eating, then stop moving much. Then they'd just—" He stopped. "Slow." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Were the first ones to go the animals that grazed closest to the creek?" The question hit him like something physical. He pulled back through his memory, through the terrible sameness of those mornings when he'd walked out and found another animal down, and he tried to remember where they'd been, which section of the range they'd been on. Yes, he said slowly. The two that went first were both in the north section. That's the closest to... He stopped. Clara didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Ethan drove the last 10 minutes to the ranch in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence of the first 30. The ranch was exactly what it was, which was not good. Ethan saw it every day and had stopped really seeing it, the way you stopped seeing the wear on a familiar face, but watching Clara take it in for the first time made him see it again with her eyes. The main barn had a section of roof that had caved in during a hailstorm in June and been only partially patched. Two of the fence lines visible from the drive were down or leaning at angles that made them decorative rather than functional. The house itself was solid. His father had built it to last, but it had the look of a place where one person had been trying to maintain what two people built, and the effort was starting to lose. Clara got down from the wagon without waiting for his hand and stood looking at the house for a moment. Then she turned and looked at the barn. Then the fence lines. "Where do you sleep?" she asked. The question surprised him enough that he answered it honestly. "In the house. There's a room off the back. I've been using that one since..." He stopped. "There's a larger room off the front. That one would be yours." She nodded. "And the cattle? Where are they right now?" "North Range mostly. There's a shelter near the creek section for the ones that are weakest." "I'd like to see them before it gets dark," she said. Ethan stood there for a moment, looking at this woman he had agreed to marry standing in front of his failing ranch with her battered suitcase at her feet and her notebook under her arm, asking to go look at sick cattle before she'd even seen the inside of the house she was going to live in. "You haven't eaten," he said. "The train was delayed." "I'm not hungry yet," she said. "The cattle matter more right now." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just said all right and led her toward the North Range. The cattle were in worse shape than he'd wanted to admit even to himself. 6 of the remaining 23 were showing the slow, dull-eyed lethargy that preceded the worst. 2 of them had stopped eating. Ethan walked through them with the sick helplessness that had become his constant companion over the last months, pointing out the ones that concerned him most, describing the progression of symptoms. Clara walked with him, but she wasn't just listening to him. She was watching the animals with a focused, methodical attention that reminded him oddly of the doctor from Billings, who came out twice a year, that same quality of looking without assumptions. She crouched down beside one of the weaker animals and examined it carefully without touching it yet. Then she stood and walked not toward the creek, but along the bank upstream, looking at the ground, the plants, the water's edge. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, stopping and pointing at a low-growing plant with dark-veined leaves spreading thick along a stretch of the bank. Ethan looked at it. "It's always grown there, some kind of weed." "It's water hemlock," Clara said quietly, "or something very close to it. It grows in wet soil near creeks and streams. The roots especially, they're highly toxic. To cattle, horses, even dogs. When an animal drinks from water that's been sitting near those roots or eats anything that's grown near them..." She paused. "It accumulates over time, slowly. It doesn't kill immediately, which is why it's easy to miss." Ethan stared at the plant. He had walked past it 10,000 times. "My grandmother lost 2 horses to it once." Clara continued, her voice even matter-of-fact. "A creek bank near her farm in Kentucky. She didn't know what it was at first either. By the time she figured it out, both horses were gone. She spent the rest of her life knowing exactly what it looked like." Ethan crouched down and looked at the plant as if seeing it for the first time. Which in every way that mattered, he was. It was ordinary. It was nothing. It had been sitting here slowly poisoning his cattle for how long? "A year more." "More can the animals recover?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "The ones that haven't had too much exposure, yes, with clean water and time." She straightened. "We need to divert the cattle away from this section of the creek immediately, and the plants have to come out, roots and all. It's not quick work, but it's not complicated either." Ethan stood slowly. He looked at the plant, then at his sick cattle, then at this woman who had been in Montana territory for approximately 3 hours and had just identified the thing that had been killing his livelihood since before he understood what was happening. "How did you know to look?" he asked. Clara looked back at the creek. "I didn't know," she said. "But the symptoms you described on the wagon, the slowness of it, the pattern starting near water, it was worth checking." Something moved in Ethan's chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something more cautious than hope. Something that recognized hope from a distance and wasn't ready to fully approach it yet. "We should get back before dark," he said. "I'll start moving the herd first thing tomorrow." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Tonight would be better," she said. "The ones that are already symptomatic. The fencing on the south pasture isn't reliable. Show me." He looked at her. She looked back at him. There was no challenge in her expression, no attempt to force the issue. Just a steady patience that somehow felt more insistent than argument. They spent the next 2 hours fixing fence by lantern light. Clara worked without complaint and without drama. She wasn't pretending the work was easy. She was breathing hard by the end, and at one point she hit her knuckle on a fence post and he saw the wince cross her face before she covered it, but she kept going. She knew how to use a fence stretcher, which surprised him. She knew how to drive a stake, which surprised him more. When they finally got the south pasture secured enough to hold the weaker animals, the stars were fully out and the lantern was burning low. "Your grandmother taught you fencing too?" Ethan asked. "My grandmother taught me that if something needs doing, and you're the one who can do it, then you do it." Clara examined the wire where they'd last joined it and gave it a firm test pull. It held. She was a practical woman. They drove the weakest 6 animals to the south pasture in the dark, moving slowly, both of them working the animals with a patience that the situation demanded and exhaustion made difficult. Ethan found himself watching away. Clara moved among the cattle unhurried, non-threatening, reading each animal's reluctance and adjusting without frustration. "You've worked with animals before," he said. "Not a question this time. Goats mostly, chickens, a few pigs. My grandmother had everything." She paused, guiding a reluctant heifer around a fence corner. "Come on, sweetheart. I know it's not where you want to be." The heifer moved. But cattle behave in the same basic ways. They want to go where their instinct tells them, and they'll fight you if you fight them. Work with the instinct, and they'll usually cooperate. Ethan filed that away without comment. By the time they walked back to the house, it was well past 9 o'clock. He heated up what he had: salt pork, cold biscuits, some beans from that morning, and put it on the table without apology, because there was nothing to apologize it into something better. Clara ate without comment, and with the honest appetite of someone who had been traveling all day and working for 2 hours and hadn't eaten since before noon. "The room is ready," Ethan said when they'd finished. "I mean, it's clean. I made sure of that." "Thank you," she said. He stood at the other side of the table, not knowing exactly how to navigate the end of this particular day. "I know this isn't what you imagined," he said finally. "The ranch, the situation, none of it." Clara looked at him for a moment. "What did you imagine?" she asked. "Pardon. When you wrote to the agency, what did you imagine the arrangement would look like?" He thought about it honestly. "Someone who could manage the house," he said. "Help with the kitchen and the books. Maybe, I don't know. I wasn't thinking very clearly at the time." "You thought you needed help with the housework," Clara said. Not unkindly. "I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought the problem was that I was alone, and the work was too much for one person. I didn't realize—" He stopped again. "That the problem was bigger than the work," she finished. He looked at her. She wasn't accusing him. She was just naming the thing they had both now seen. "I'll fix the water situation," he said. "Starting tomorrow. The hemlock, the diversion." "We'll fix it," she said. He stopped. "I didn't come here to manage your house, Mr. Caldwell," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely certain. "I came here because I have skills, and I needed a reason to use them. Your ranch needs saving. That is a reason." She stood and picked up the lantern. "Good night." He sat at the empty table for a long time after her door closed. In the morning, she was already outside when he woke up. He found her at the creek, not near the hemlock section, but 50 yards upstream, examining the ground with the same methodical attention she'd brought to everything else the day before. She had a stick and was drawing something in the mud of the bank, a rough map of the water flow. "Morning," he said. "The creek bends here," she said without looking up. "If we cut a new channel 40 feet east, we can redirect the main flow around the hemlock growth. The old channel will dry out within a week or two. Without the water to sustain the roots, the plants will be much easier to clear." He looked at her drawing in the mud. It was actually a sensible diagram. The kind of thing Dutch might have thought of eventually, maybe given a month of considering it. "You worked this out last night?" he asked. "This morning. I woke early." He crouched beside her and looked at the diagram. "That's a day's work of digging," he said. "For 2 people. Then we should start now." They started now. By mid-morning they had the main channel cut 6 feet into new ground. By noon they had it 10. The work was punishing hard clay soil that didn't yield easily, and roots from old brush that had to be cut and pulled before the digging could continue. Ethan took the heavier breaking work. Clara took the clearing and shaping, which required precision more than brute force, and proved to be something she was better suited to anyway. They didn't talk much while they worked. There wasn't the breath for conversation, and the work required attention. But there was something in the rhythm of 2 people working toward the same thing. Something Ethan had almost forgotten existed that made the silence feel less like loneliness and more like company. Just before noon, Pete Donovan rode by on the North Trail. He pulled up his horse when he saw them and sat there for a moment with an expression that mixed surprise and something less charitable. "Ethan," he called. "What are you 2 doing down there?" "Working," Ethan said without stopping. Pete looked at Clara, who also didn't stop working. "That's your bride. She's digging ditches. We're redirecting the creek channel," Clara said, not looking up. Her voice was level and carrying and perfectly clear. "Mr. Caldwell's cattle have been drinking contaminated water. The plants along the original bank have been making them sick. We're cutting a new path around the affected area." Pete stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I looked," she said. There was a pause. Pete looked at Ethan, who met his gaze with an expression that didn't invite commentary. Pete looked back at Clara, who had already returned entirely to her work. "Huh," Pete said. He rode on. Ethan waited until the sound of hooves faded. "He'll tell everyone in town by tonight." "Let him," Clara said. "They'll say—" "I know what they'll say," she interrupted, not with anger, but with the tiredness of someone who had known for a long time exactly what people said. "It doesn't change the work." Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his shovel and went back to work. By late afternoon, the new channel was cut, and they had begun redirecting the water. The old creek bed was already beginning to show the first signs of reduced flow. It would take days before the hemlock section dried out completely, and longer before the plants could be safely cleared, but the change was underway. They walked back to the house at dusk with dirt up to their elbows and the particular exhaustion that comes from work that actually mattered. "I need to tell you something," Ethan said. Clara looked at him. "The agency asked me to send a letter back, confirming that as the arrangement has certain—" He stopped. This was harder to say than he'd expected. "You don't have to stay. If this isn't what you wanted when you agreed to come, the situation is—" He gestured vaguely at everything around them. "It's not easy." Clara stopped walking. She turned to face him, and the look she gave him was not soft or reassuring. It was direct and level and slightly impatient, in the way of a person who had very little patience for people underselling what they were capable of. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I grew up with a grandmother who homesteaded alone after her husband died, who kept animals and a garden and 6 acres of land through 3 bad winters and 1 flood, and who still had enough left over at the end to teach me everything she knew. I am not afraid of not easy." She paused. "Are you trying to send me back?" "No," he said, and meant it more than he expected to. "Then stop apologizing for the ranch," she said. "It's a good piece of land under a bad run of luck. We can work with that." She turned and went inside. Ethan stood in the yard for a moment in the failing light, looking at the house at the barn beyond it, at the long slope of his father's land running north toward the mountains. We can work with that. He hadn't heard anyone say we in a long time. He went inside. Over the next several days, something began to shift on Caldwell Ranch. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet, incremental way that real change usually happens. One correct decision layering on top of another until the direction became unmistakable. The creek diversion worked. The flow through the hemlock section reduced to a trickle by the third day and had effectively stopped by the fifth. Clara began the careful, methodical process of clearing the plants from the affected bank, not just pulling what was visible, but digging out the root systems entirely, the way her grandmother had insisted, because root poison was the part that mattered, and leaving the roots left the problem. The cattle that had been moved to the south pasture were drinking from the clean water barrel Ethan hauled out twice a day and were beginning to show signs of recovery. Not dramatically, it was slow, the way it had been slow going the other direction, but the dull eyes were clearing. The animals were beginning to move with more intention. Two of the weakest ones were still concerning, but the others were eating again. It's going to take weeks for them to fully recover, Clara told him on the fourth evening. But I think we'll keep most of them. Most of them. After months of watching them die for reasons he hadn't understood, most of them was something close to extraordinary. How did your grandmother know about the hemlock? Ethan asked. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and the question came out without him particularly planning it. Was she a doctor? An herbalist? Farmers called her a healer, Clara said. She just said she paid attention. She believed that if you really looked at the land around you, really looked at it instead of just working on it, the land would tell you what was wrong. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Most people don't look. They see what they expect to see. She taught me to be suspicious of my own expectations. Ethan thought about that. That's what you were doing on the wagon, he said. When you asked about the creek, I had expectations coming in, she said. I set them aside and asked about what you'd actually observed. You set aside a lot, he said. He wasn't sure what he meant exactly, but he felt the truth of it. Clara looked at him. For a moment she didn't say anything. Then, so did you. Enough to at least look for someone when you needed help. I didn't do a very good job of welcoming you, he said. At the platform. No, she agreed. You didn't. He appreciated that she didn't soften it. I'm not good at... He stopped. I've been alone out here for 2 years, since my wife. He stopped again. This was territory he hadn't crossed with words in a very long time. Clara waited. She died, he said finally. 3 years ago, in the winter. It was fast. He looked at the table. The ranch started going wrong around the same time. I've been trying to figure out which one caused the other, but I think it was just two things happening at once. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm sorry about your wife. Her name was Anne. He said it out loud, and then was surprised that he had. I don't say her name much. You should, Clara said gently. Names keep people present. He looked at her. Is there someone you've lost? My grandmother, she said. A year ago. She was the last family I had. She said it simply without the particular brand of grief that asked for comfort, but he recognized the weight of it because he carried his own version. Is that why you agreed to come? He asked. The agency. Partly. I needed somewhere to go that needed what I had to give. She looked at her coffee cup. I wasn't going to sit in someone else's house and take in sewing for the rest of my life. Ethan almost smiled. It surprised him enough that he pressed it back. You laughed, she said. Almost, he admitted. She looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of its own almost smile. Progress, she said. He did smile then briefly, the first real one in longer than he could accurately track. They sat with the quiet for a while, and it was the kind of quiet that had changed in character from the first night. Not the silence of two strangers who had nothing to say to each other, but something different, something that didn't need to be filled. 2 days later, the thing happened that Ethan had been dreading without knowing he was dreading it. Margaret Hale came to call. She arrived in the late morning in her buggy, with Ruth beside her, dressed in the visiting clothes that small towns still maintained for the ritual of calling on a newly arrived bride. She brought a pie which was genuine, and a set of questions which were not. Clara met them at the door with her hands still dirty from the garden, because she had been out there since early morning and had not had time to clean up before the buggy appeared on the drive. Ethan watched from the barn door. "My goodness," Margaret said, looking at Clara's hands with the expression of a woman filing information. "You've been gardening." "Turning the kitchen plot," Clara said pleasantly. "The soil hasn't been worked in a season at least. It needed breaking up." "Well, you're certainly industrious," Margaret said in a tone that made industrious sound like a consolation prize. She came in. Ruth came in. They sat in the front room. Clara put the kettle on. Ethan drifted closer to the open window without fully admitting to himself that he was listening. "And how are you finding Montana Territory?" Margaret asked. "Demanding," Clara said. "And beautiful, both at once." "I imagine it's quite a change from Tennessee." "It is." "And Mr. Caldwell, you've had time to get acquainted." Ethan held very still. "We've been working," Clara said. "The ranch needed attention." "Yes, I'd heard." A pause that was doing a great deal of work. "I'd heard there have been some difficulties with the herd." "There were," Clara said. "We've identified the problem and addressed it. The cattle are recovering." Silence. "You identified water contamination," Clara said. "Hemlock growth along the creek bank had been leaching into the water source for probably a year or more. The animals that grazed closest to that section were affected first. We've redirected the creek and cleared the plants." A pause. "Would you like some coffee, Mrs. Hale?" Another silence. Longer. "You knew about that?" Ruth asked. Her voice was younger and genuinely curious, rather than performing. "About the hemlock, the plants. My grandmother taught me," Clara said. "She believed in learning to read the land. It saves a lot of guessing." Ethan heard the coffee being poured. "Where did you learn about ranching?" Margaret asked, and the tone had shifted just slightly, still watchful, but the particular confidence she'd arrived with had developed a crack. "Farming mostly," Clara said. "Animals, soil, water systems. My grandmother had land in Kentucky before we moved to Tennessee. Small operation, but she ran it completely by herself for 20 years after my grandfather died. I learned at her side from the time I could walk." "And your figure," Margaret said, and then seemed to realize that even for her, this had crossed a line and shifted quickly. "That is the work. Don't find it?" "I find it very natural," Clara said. Her voice was perfectly even. "I've worked this way my whole life. Size is a story people tell with their eyes. It doesn't have much to do with what a person can actually do." Ethan pressed his lips together. He had spent the last 2 days watching Clara dig a creek diversion in clay soil, haul water barrels, pull hemlock, root systems from the ground, fix fence wire, and move 200 pounds of cattle feed from the wagon to the barn. He had stopped thinking about her size on approximately the second day, not because it stopped being something his eyes noted, but because it had become entirely irrelevant to the fact of who she actually was. When Margaret Hale and Ruth left an hour later, the pie was on the kitchen table, and the conversation had traveled a long way from where it began. Ruth had asked 3 more questions about the hemlock and water systems. Margaret had been largely quiet for the second half of the visit, in the specific way of a person who came in with a story and found the story wasn't cooperating. Clara came back out to the garden after they left. "Well," she said, picking up her trowel. "Well," Ethan agreed. She looked at him over her shoulder. "Were you listening the whole time?" "Part of it," he said. She turned back to the garden. "I don't need defending," she said. "But I appreciate that you stayed close." He hadn't known that that was what he'd been doing. But once she said it, he understood that it was. He went back to work. That evening, he walked the North Range alone for the first time in weeks, without feeling like he was walking toward failure. The cattle in the south pasture were standing and moving. The new creek channel was running clean. The old channel, already drying, had lost the thick, stagnant quality that he could now recognize as one of the signs he had missed. He stood at the edge of the range, looking at his father's land in the last of the evening light, and thought about something his father had written in that letter. The land doesn't care how proud you are. Neither did Clara. It turned out. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Caldwell stood on his own land and didn't feel entirely alone. The hemlock was gone from the bank by the end of the second week. Not just cut back, gone roots and all the way. Clara had insisted from the beginning. Ethan had questioned it at first, not because he doubted her reasoning, but because he was tired in his bones, and pulling root systems out of wet clay soil was the kind of work that made a man want to argue with the necessity of thoroughness. Clara had looked at him with that particular patience of hers that somehow managed to be more insistent than any argument, and said, half the job is a different job. So they pulled every root, every one. The cattle in the south pasture were eating on their own now. All of them. Even the two that had been so far gone that Ethan had started thinking about what he'd do when he lost them. They were standing steady, moving with purpose, dropping their heads to the water barrel with a thirst that meant their bodies were working again the way they were supposed to. He had walked through that pasture 3 mornings in a row before he let himself believe what he was seeing. On the third morning, he stopped in the middle of the herd and just stood there, not checking anything, not calculating anything, just standing in the middle of 23 living animals on his father's land, and letting the reality of it settle into him the way a long drink settles into a man who has been thirsty too long. Clara found him there. She didn't say anything at first. She came through the gate and walked out to where he was standing and looked at the animals with him. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of August morning that reminded you summer had a limit, and the cattle moved around them in their slow, deliberate way, unbothered by human presence, the way a healthy herd is unbothered. "They're going to make it," Ethan said. He hadn't planned to say it out loud. "Yes," Clara said simply. "They are." He looked at her. She was watching the heifer that had been the sickest, the one he'd been most certain he would lose, as it crossed the pasture with easy, deliberate steps. Something in Clara's expression was private and satisfied in a way that she wasn't performing for him, which meant he was seeing something real, and he found he was unexpectedly grateful for that. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him then. "Thank me when the herd is back on the North Range," she said. "We're not there yet." She walked back to the gate. He watched her go, then he followed. The work that week shifted from crisis management to something harder in a different way. The long, unglamorous labor of rebuilding a ranch that had been neglected for 2 years. There was no emergency driving it now, no urgency to force through exhaustion. There was only the steady accumulation of necessary tasks. Fencing that had to be replaced post by post, a section of barn roof that needed proper repair, rather than the tarp that had been covering the gap since June. A kitchen garden that Clara was determined to establish before the first frost, because she had done the calculation and understood that they could not afford to buy through winter what they could grow before it. Ethan threw himself into the work with something that felt different from the grim obligation that had driven him all year. He couldn't entirely name the difference, but it existed. It was on a Thursday, 8 days after the creek diversion was complete, when things on Caldwell Ranch intersected with the town of Harlow in a way Ethan had not anticipated. He had ridden in for supplies: flour, salt, pork, nails, wire, the ordinary provisioning of a working ranch. He left Clara finishing the second row of fencing along the garden border and rode in alone, which in hindsight he would reconsider. The feed store was owned by a man named Gerald Cross, who was also the informal clearinghouse for every piece of news and opinion in Harlow. Gerald knew everything about everyone, and considered this both his right and his civic duty. He was not a malicious man precisely, but he was the kind of man who had very firm ideas about the way things should be, and who didn't update those ideas comfortably when reality failed to cooperate. Gerald was stacking grain sacks when Ethan came in. He looked up with the pleasantness of a man who is genuinely glad to see someone because he has things to tell them. "Ethan, just the man. I was going to ride out this week." "Gerald." Ethan set his list on the counter. "Just the usual." Gerald looked at the list, then he looked up. "I heard your wife identified some kind of plant problem with the herd. Margaret Hale was telling it around. Clara identified a water contamination issue, Ethan said. Hemlock in the creek bank. We've addressed it. Hemlock, Gerald repeated. And she knew about that from where exactly? Tennessee. From her grandmother, Ethan said. Who knew about it from farming? Is there a problem with that? Gerald held up both hands in the gesture of a man who isn't arguing, which was exactly what a man who was arguing looked like when he didn't want to admit it. No problem. No problem at all. I heard some talk is all, and I thought you should know. Ethan looked at him steadily. What kind of talk? Well? Gerald set down the bag he was holding. People are wondering. You know how people are. They're wondering whether a woman from out of state that is without any formal... He stopped and redirected. Some folks are saying you might have been that the agency might not have been entirely forthcoming about what they were sending. What they were sending, Ethan repeated. Gerald had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. About her situation, her appearance, are you saying that because my wife is a large woman, she might not be capable of the work she's been doing? The silence in the feed store was significant. I'm not saying that, Gerald said quickly. I'm just people talk. What people? Gerald glanced at the door. Tom Haskell was saying some things at the saloon. That you'd been taken advantage of. By the agency. That they'd misrepresented. My wife. Ethan said, his voice dropping about half a register in the way it dropped when he was done with pleasantries, has worked the kind of hours in the last 10 days that would have flattened 3 of the men in this town. She identified a problem that had been killing my cattle for over a year that no one else came out here and noticed. She redirected a creek channel, cleared 200 feet of contaminated bank, rebuilt 3 sections of fence, and turned the kitchen plot by hand. He picked up his list from the counter. If Tom Haskell has something to say about what I was sold, he can ride out and say it to my face. Otherwise, I'd be grateful if my supply order was ready by noon. Gerald looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and started pulling the order. Ethan stood at the counter and felt the anger cooling in his chest into something harder and more durable. He hadn't expected to be defending Clara to the feed store owner. He hadn't expected to feel quite this strongly about the necessity of it. But when he pulled the wagon around to load the supplies an hour later, Tom Haskell was leaning against the wall of the saloon across the street. Haskell was a rancher from the east side of the valley, a man who had done well enough to have opinions about everyone else, and poorly enough in recent years that those opinions had gotten louder. He was somewhere around 50, with a manner that was friendly on the surface, in the way that some dangerous things are friendly on the surface. Ethan, he called across the street. Ethan looked up from the loading. Heard your wife's been busy out there, Haskell said, crossing toward him with his thumbs in his pockets. Fixing your cattle situation. That's right, Ethan said. Haskell stopped a comfortable distance away and tilted his head. What kind of a woman knows about that kind of thing, hemlock and creek business? A knowledgeable one, Ethan said. Haskell laughed in the way of a man who doesn't find something funny, but wants it to look that way. She was something riding in on the train, I'll give her that. Not what anybody expected. No, Ethan agreed. She wasn't. Word of advice, Haskell said, and his voice dropped into the register of friendly concern that Ethan recognized as something else entirely. The agency that sent her, you might want to look into what you actually agreed to. Mail order arrangements have standards, and if what arrived doesn't meet. Haskell, Ethan said. He stopped loading. He set down the sack he was holding and turned to face the man fully. I'm going to say this once. Clara Whitman arrived at this ranch and went straight to work. She worked harder in 2 weeks than most people work in 2 months. She's smart, she's competent, and she's the best thing that has happened to Caldwell Ranch since my father built it. He picked up the sack again. If you have concerns about the arrangement, I suggest you concern yourself with your own. Haskell's expression didn't change for a moment. Then something hardened under the surface of it. Suit yourself, he said, and walked back toward the saloon. Ethan loaded the rest of the supplies in silence. His hands were steady. The anger was still there, but controlled, pressed flat under the weight of everything he had to get back to. He drove home, thinking about Clara at the garden border, pulling fence wire through her hands without complaint. He drove home thinking about the expression on her face in the south pasture that morning, watching the heifer walk. He drove home thinking about the fact that he hadn't once in 2 weeks thought to warn her that the town was going to have opinions about who she was, that the protection he hadn't thought to offer had been needed. When he got back, she was not at the garden border. He found her in the barn, and she was not alone. Jeb Coker was leaning against the barn door with his arms folded and his hat on the back of his head, in the way he wore it when he was feeling comfortable about something. And that feeling of comfort immediately put Ethan on edge, because Jeb Coker being comfortable about something on your property was rarely a good sign. Jeb worked a small claim on the other side of the north slope, a marginal operation that he supplemented by being useful to Haskell in ways that were never entirely clearly defined. He was younger than Haskell by 15 years and had the easy manner of a man who assumed he would be liked. Clara was standing in the barn with a bucket and a brush, working on one of the recovered cattle that had been brought in for examination, and her posture was the posture of a woman who was continuing to do her work, while someone in her vicinity was making that work less pleasant. Ethan came in. Jeb looked at him and grinned. "Ethan, just stopped by to offer a hand." "I didn't ask for one," Ethan said. "Well, your wife and I were just having a conversation." He glanced at Clara. "She's something else, isn't she? Very capable." The way he said capable meant something other than capable. Clara continued working and did not look at either of them. "We're good here, Jeb," Ethan said. His voice was flat as a board, just being neighborly. But Jeb's eyes moved to Clara with the specific attention of a man who has decided a woman is a thing to evaluate. "I was saying to Clara, it must be quite a change. Montana, the ranch life. Quite different from—" "Jeb," Ethan said. Jeb looked at him. "Get off my property." A moment of silence. Jeb's grin stayed on his face, but his eyes went to something calculated. "No need to be unfriendly. I'm being very clear," Ethan said. "That's different from unfriendly. Get off my property." Jeb unfolded from the barn door and put his hat straight on his head in the gesture of a man who wants to look unbothered. He looked at Clara one more time. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell," he said with an emphasis on the name that was its own kind of insult. He left. Ethan waited until the sound of his horse faded. Then he turned to Clara. "Did he say something inappropriate?" "Nothing I haven't heard before," she said. She was still brushing the animal, her strokes even, and unhurried. "That doesn't mean—" "I know what it means," she said. "And I know how to handle it." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "I've been handling it my whole life, Ethan." It was the first time she'd used his given name. She did it so naturally that he wasn't sure she noticed. "What I'm not accustomed to," she continued, "is having someone make them leave." I didn't say anything to that for a moment. "He'll come back," Ethan said. "Or he'll send someone else. He's working for Haskell." Clara set down the brush. She turned to face him. "What does Haskell want?" This was the moment when Ethan had to tell her something he should have told her days ago, and the weight of not having told her pressed down on him as he said it. "Haskell's been after this land for 2 years. Not because he wants to ranch it, he's not interested in the work of it. He wants the water rights. The creek that runs through the north section is one of 3 primary feeds into the main valley irrigation. If he controls this land, he controls a significant portion of where the water goes." Clara looked at him. Her expression didn't panic. It did something more useful, it sharpened. "And he knew you were in trouble." "He's been watching me go under for 2 years, Ethan said, "waiting for me to reach the point where I had to sell." "And then I arrived," Clara said slowly, "and the cattle started recovering. And suddenly the ranch isn't as close to collapse as he expected." She was quiet for a moment, processing. He sent Jeb to look at the situation. "That's my read. And the talk in town." "Some of it may be Haskell stirring," Ethan said. "He has people there." Clara turned that over. Then she looked at Ethan directly. "Why didn't you tell me this when I arrived?" The question was not accusatory. It was honest and direct, and it deserved the same in return. Because I wasn't sure you'd stay, he said, and because I was ashamed of how far things had gotten. She looked at him for a long moment. If we're going to save this ranch, she said, I need to know everything about it. The land, the debts, the enemies, all of it. I know, he said. I should have. Yes, she said. You should have. She picked up the bucket. Tell me tonight. Everything. And I'll tell you what I think we should do about it. He nodded. She walked past him toward the barn door and stopped. Ethan. He looked at her. Thank you for making him leave. She went out. He stood in the empty barn and understood that something had just changed between them. The shift from two people in close proximity to something that required more honesty and more trust, and was therefore more dangerous and more necessary at the same time. That evening after dinner, he spread everything on the kitchen table. The deed, the mortgage papers, the account ledger, the outstanding bills, the note from the bank in Billings that he'd been avoiding opening for 6 weeks. Clara sat across from him and read every page with the careful attention of someone who was not intimidated by numbers and did not flinch at bad news. She read the banknote. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the ledger and started writing figures in her notebook. How many acres is the north section? She asked. About 400. The creek runs diagonally through the middle. And what's the current grazing capacity if the herd recovers fully? In a good year, I can run 60 head on the north and south sections combined. What's the market price for cattle right now? He told her. She wrote it down. And if you ran 55 head through a full summer on recovered grass, she calculated. After operating costs, that's enough to clear the banknote and have a margin left. She looked up. If we can get the herd to 55 head by next summer. I'm at 23 right now, he said. 23 healthy animals won't. You don't have to get there all at once, she said. But you need to start. She turned the notebook around so he could see her numbers. If you sell the 6 recovered animals now, the ones that grazed closest to the hemlock, they'll need the most time before they're fully productive. You get enough to buy 12 younger healthy animals. That brings you to 29. By spring with normal calving, you're looking at 35 to 40. By next summer, 55 is possible, he said slowly, following the numbers. If the grass comes back. She paused. And it will come back. The North Range hasn't been overgrazed. It's been rested whether you wanted to rest it or not. That's actually in your favor. He looked at her numbers. He looked at the banknote. He looked at the face of the woman across the table who had arrived 2 weeks ago and who had spent those 2 weeks saving his cattle and was now sitting here at 9 o'clock in the evening, calculating his way out of debt with the focus of someone who intended to succeed. Clara, he said. She looked up. Where did you learn to do that? The numbers. My grandmother kept books for her farm, she said, and for 2 neighbors who couldn't manage their own. She said that pride about money was the thing that killed more farms than drought ever did. She closed the notebook. You've been too ashamed to look at the full picture. Once you look, it's not as impossible as it feels. He looked at the papers on the table. It's not impossible, he agreed. It's very difficult. Yes, she said. But difficult is workable. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised him. I want to go to town. He looked at her. When? Saturday. I want to go to the market, and I want people to see me there. She met his gaze steadily. If Haskell is going to use the town against us, then we need to be in the town, not hiding out here letting stories grow. Ethan considered this. It went against every instinct he had, which was precisely how he knew she was right. It won't be comfortable, he said. I'm aware, she said. People will stare. They already stare, she said. The question is what they see when they do. Saturday came around with the clarity of a late August morning, cool at the edges and bright in the center, and Ethan pulled the wagon around with a sense of doing something that required more courage than he usually assigned to market days. Clara came out of the house in her second dress, still plain, still worn, but clean and pressed with her hair done properly, and her notebook tucked as always under her arm. She climbed up to the wagon seat and said, "Ready," and they went. Harlow on a Saturday had the particular energy of a frontier town, doing its weekly business wagon traffic voices, carrying the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, competing with the less pleasant smells of the street. People moved and called to each other with the easy familiarity of a small community. They saw the wagon. They saw Clara. And the watching started. Ethan felt it the way you feel. Weather coming. A change in the quality of the air. Conversations going quiet, and then starting up again at a different pitch. He kept his posture level and his expression neutral and drove straight for the market stalls. Clara descended from the wagon and began examining the produce with the practical attention of a woman who knew what she was looking for, and she did not acknowledge the watching in any way, except by continuing to exist calmly within it. Old May Patterson, who ran the vegetable stall, and who had lived in Harlow since before half the buildings were standing, looked at Clara with the evaluating eye of a woman who had seen everything and decided what she thought about it with brisk efficiency. "You're Caldwell's wife," May said. Not unkindly, just directly. "Clara Caldwell," Clara agreed. She picked up a bundle of dried herbs and examined it. "Is this your own growing or traded in?" "My own," May said with a flicker of something that might have been surprise at the question. "Dried them myself last month." "Sage and something else," Clara said. "Thyme. Wild thyme from the North Slope." May watched her. "You know your herbs." "My grandmother grew everything," Clara said. She set the bundle down and picked up another lavender. "May I ask, do you carry anything for animal dosing? I've been looking for something specific." "Depends what you need," May said. And then she leaned on her counter and they began talking, and Ethan stood 2 feet away and watched Clara Whitman. Clara Caldwell transformed a stallkeeper from a cautious observer to an engaged participant in the span of 4 minutes through the simple mechanism of knowing what she was talking about and being genuinely interested in the answer. It happened again at the dry goods table. It happened a third time when Ruth Hale came by and stopped to ask Clara a question about the hemlock that was clearly burning in her and that she had clearly been waiting for the opportunity to ask. Clara answered it without condescension, with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness that she brought to every piece of knowledge, and Ruth stood there nodding with the fascinated attention of a girl who had not been taught that she was allowed to be interested in useful things. Then Haskell arrived. He came from the direction of the saloon, which was where men like Haskell spent Saturday mornings, and he had 2 other men with him. Jeb was one, and the 3 of them moved through the market with the ease of men who owned the social landscape of the place. He stopped when he saw Ethan. He looked at Clara. He didn't say anything immediately. He just stood there with a man on each side of him and looked at the situation with the calculating attention of someone working out angles. "Caldwell," he said finally. "Doing the Saturday market." "Haskell," Ethan said. Haskell's gaze moved to Clara. "Mrs. Caldwell, you settling in all right out there?" Clara looked at him with the same even regard she brought to everything. "Very well, thank you," she said. "Quite a project you've taken on," Haskell said. "Caldwell Ranch in its current state. Brave of you." "It's a good ranch," Clara said. "Good land, good water, good bones. It just needed some attention." Haskell's expression shifted slightly. "Good water," he repeated. "Yes," Clara said. She picked up a jar from May's stall, examined it, set it down. "The North Creek in particular. Once we cleared the contamination from the bank, the flow is excellent, very clean." She looked at him with perfect pleasantness. "Best water source in this part of the valley, I'd think." The silence around them had taken on a particular quality. May Patterson was very still. Ruth Hale had gone quiet. Jeb looked at Haskell. Haskell looked at Clara with a new attention, the recalibration of a man who has just realized the thing he underestimated has teeth. "Is that right?" he said. "Mr. Haskell," Clara said, and her voice stayed light and conversational. "I want to thank you for your concern about the ranch. I understand you've been keeping an eye on the situation there for some time. It's kind of a neighbor to worry." The word "kind" sat in the sentence like a stone. "But I think you'll find things are improving considerably. We're planning to expand the herd in the spring." She smiled at him, not a warm smile, but a perfectly calibrated one, and turned back to May's stall. Haskell stood for another moment. Then he nodded at no one in particular and walked on. Ethan waited until he was far enough away. Then he said quietly, "That was a very specific thing to say to him." "I know," Clara said just as quietly. She was looking at the lavender bundle again. "I needed him to understand that we know what he wants, and that what he wants is no longer available." She put the bundle in her basket. "Better he hears it now, saves everyone time." May Patterson, who had heard every word, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. She sold Clara the lavender at half price. The drive home was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Then Ethan said, "You weren't afraid of him." "I was," Clara said. "I'm afraid of anyone who has something to take." She looked at the road ahead. But being afraid and showing it are two different things. My grandmother said that the most important thing in any difficult situation is to be the calmest person in it, because the calmest person controls the tone. "Was your grandmother afraid of much?" Ethan asked. "Everything," Clara said. "She was afraid of losing the farm, afraid of the winter, afraid of the debt, afraid of being alone. She just never let the fear make the decisions." He thought about that for a while. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She was," Clara said. Something quiet moved in her voice. "She was the best person I knew." The road ran through a stretch of open country, where the mountains were fully visible on 3 sides, and the afternoon light made everything long and golden in the way that August afternoons did before they started shortening. "Clara," Ethan said. She looked at him. "I'm going to need a few days to ride the full fence line, the sections I haven't checked in months. I've been afraid of what I'd find." He paused. "Would you come?" She looked at him for a moment, with an expression he was beginning to learn to read, the slight focusing of the eyes that meant she was deciding whether the thing she was hearing was true. "You don't want to see it alone," she said. "No," he admitted. She nodded. "Then I'll come." They rode out the following morning at dawn. The fence line told a story that was worse in some places and better in others than what he'd imagined during the 2 years of not looking at it directly. There were 3 sections that would need complete replacement posts, rotted wire broken, and 2 more that needed serious repair. But the northeast corner, which he'd been most worried about, had held. The posts his father had put in there 30 years ago were still solid, which made something move in his chest in a way he didn't try to explain. Clara walked the line beside him and looked at each section with the same practical inventory she brought to everything. She wrote things in her notebook. She asked questions when she had questions, and was quiet when she didn't. Mid-morning they stopped to water the horses at a spring that fed a small natural pool in a hollow of the North Range. It was a good water source, clean cold, fed by snowmelt from high on the slope, and Ethan had always known about it without ever doing anything about it. "Do the cattle use this?" Clara asked. "Not regularly. It's not on their main range." She crouched by the edge and looked at the water and the ground around it. Then she looked up at the slope above. "If you ran a simple channel from here to the south pasture, you'd have a clean supplemental water source without depending entirely on the creek." "That's 200 yards of digging," he said. She looked at him with the expression that meant she had already decided the work was worth doing and was simply waiting for him to reach the same conclusion. "Yes," she said. He looked at the pool. He looked at the slope. He did the calculation that included the creek restoration, the herd health, the long game she'd laid out at the kitchen table. "You're right," he said. "We'll do it." She stood and dusted off her hands and looked at him with something that was very close to approval, and he found that he wanted to keep earning that look without being able to entirely explain why. They finished the fence survey by late afternoon and started back with a list of what needed doing, ranked by urgency, written in Clara's handwriting in her brown notebook. The ranch was visible from the top of the north slope, the house, the barn, the fences, the south pasture where the cattle were still gathered, the new creek channel catching the late light. Clara pulled up her horse and looked at it. "My grandmother always said that land is honest," she said after a moment. "It tells you exactly what's been done to it and what's been neglected. You can't talk it into looking better than it is." She paused. "But you can work it back, if you're willing to actually see it." Ethan looked at his land. He had spent 2 years looking at it and seeing only what was failing. For the first time, he was beginning to see what could be recovered. "I'm willing," he said. Clara looked at him. Not at the land anymore. At him. "I know," she said quietly. And she started the horse back down the slope. He stayed at the top for another moment, looking at the ranch. His father's ranch. His ranch. Their ranch. And the word landed in his mind with a weight he hadn't been braced for. That there, and he let it stay there without examining it too closely, because some things needed to settle before you could look at them directly. He started down the slope after her. The channel from the north spring to the south pasture took 4 days to dig. 4 days of work that started before dawn and ended when the light gave out. 4 days of clay and rock and root systems that fought back the way this land always fought back, slow and stubborn and without any particular malice, just the indifference of ground that had never been asked to do this particular thing before. Ethan did the breaking work. Clara did the shaping and the lining, packing the channel walls with a precision that he had stopped questioning, because every precise thing she did turned out to matter exactly as much as she said it would. On the 4th afternoon, the water moved through the new channel for the first time. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no great rush of water, no visible sign that something important had just happened. The flow was slow and quiet and steady, the way real change usually announced itself, without ceremony, without fanfare, just the undeniable fact of a thing that was now different from what it had been. Clara stood at the south end and watched the water come. She pressed her lips together in the way she did when something satisfied her deeply, but she wasn't going to make a production of it. "It works," Ethan said. "It works," she agreed. He looked at her. She was filthy from 4 days of hard labor, her dress dark with soil at the knees and elbows, her hair coming loose in the particular way it came loose when she'd been working with her hands above her head. She was looking at the water with that private satisfaction that he had come to understand was the most honest expression she had, the one that appeared when she wasn't thinking about how she looked, only about what was in front of her. He thought, without planning to think it, that she was the most capable person he had ever shared a piece of land with. Then he thought, that is not all she is. He put that thought away and picked up his shovel. September came in fast that year, the way Montana Septembers could. 1 week still warm enough to work in shirt sleeves, the next, carrying a new edge in the wind that said winter was not as far away as the calendar suggested. The herd had been moved back to the North Range. All 23 of them healthy enough now to graze properly, moving through the recovering grass with the easy authority of animals that had forgotten they'd been sick. Ethan walked that range some mornings just to see them and feel the particular relief that still hadn't entirely lost its freshness. The banknote remained. The fence section still needed replacement lumber that cost money he didn't quite have yet. The barn roof patch held, but only barely, and every time the wind came up hard from the northwest, he could hear it shift in a way that needed attention before winter made it a crisis. There were still more problems than solutions on Caldwell Ranch, but the ratio had changed. For the first time in 2 years, Ethan could see that the work was catching up to the damage, slowly, the way a wound closes, not fast enough to watch, but real. Clara had begun taking on the account books in the evenings, not because he'd asked her to. She had simply appeared one night at the kitchen table with his ledger open and her notebook beside it, and started working. He had stood in the doorway for a moment and then sat down across from her, and they had worked through the numbers together, which was different from him staring at the numbers alone, in the way that two-person problems are always different from one-person problems. The same facts, but navigable now, instead of just heavy. She found something on the 3rd night. "This entry," she said, turning the ledger and pointing. "December of last year. A payment to Harlow Land Title for $40. What was that?" Ethan leaned over. "What was that?" Ethan leaned over and looked. He remembered the payment, but not clearly. "There was some kind of survey," he said. "Someone came out and walked the property line. I assumed it was routine. The bank sometimes requests them." Did the bank request it? He thought. "The letter came from the title office," he said slowly. "I assumed." "Do you still have the letter?" He went to the box where he kept documents and spent 10 minutes going through it before he found the original correspondence. He brought it to the table, and Clara read it with the concentrated stillness of a person processing something important. This wasn't requested by the bank, she said. The survey was requested by the title office in response to what they call a boundary inquiry. She looked up. Someone asked them to clarify the property lines, specifically the lines along the North Creek section. Ethan stared at the letter. Someone was already laying groundwork, Clara said. Before you were even close to the worst of the financial trouble. Someone was already inquiring about the creek boundary, probably looking for a basis to dispute it later. Haskell, Ethan said, or someone working for him. She set the letter down. This is more organized than I thought. The realization settled over the table between them, with the particular weight of a threat that turned out to be larger than its initial shape. Ethan had understood Haskell as an opportunist, a man who saw a struggling neighbor and calculated the moment to move in. What this suggested was something more patient, someone who had been watching this land for years, someone who had been preparing. He was waiting for me to fail, Ethan said. How was helping you fail? Clara said, quietly but clearly. Whether that means he interfered with anything, or simply made sure people knew you were struggling, either way, he was not a passive observer. Ethan sat with that. What do we do? We record everything, Clara said. She pulled her notebook toward her. Every boundary, every water right, every document connected to this land. We make sure we have it, and we understand it, and it's in order. And we make sure anyone who might be watching understands that this ranch is not in trouble anymore. We can't announce that we know what he's doing. No, we just make it visible that things have changed. She looked at the ledger. The cattle sale in October, you said the buyer from Billings comes through. End of the month. Sell the 6, she said, referring to the animals they'd discussed before, the ones with the longest contamination exposure. Use the money to repair the north fence completely. Something visible. Something that says this is a working ranch with a future, not a piece of land waiting to change hands. He looked at her across the table. You think like a strategist, he said. She considered that. I think like someone who grew up watching a woman survive on 20 acres by herself, she said. You can't outmuscle every problem. Sometimes you have to outthink it. He nodded slowly. And Haskell specifically. I need to know more about him, she said. What he's done with other properties, whether this is a pattern. She paused. Ruth Hale. She likes to talk and she knows this town. Would she talk to me? I think, Ethan said slowly, that Ruth Hale would talk to you about anything you asked. Clara nodded and wrote something in her notebook and closed it. They sat in the quiet of the kitchen, with the lamp burning between them, and outside the wind was picking up in the way it picked up some September nights, carrying the first real cold of the coming season, and the house held around them with the solid reliability of good construction. And Ethan thought about his father building these walls, and whether his father had ever sat at this table with a problem and someone worth solving it with. He thought his father would have liked Clara. I thought it. And then he thought about what that meant, and he didn't press further on it tonight. Ruth Hale came for a visit 3 days later. She came alone, which was in itself a signal of something. Ruth, without Margaret, was a different person, less careful, less constructed, more genuinely curious. She sat at the kitchen table with coffee and looked around the house with the frank attention of a young woman in her 20s who had been told stories about a place and wanted to compare them to reality. It looks different than I expected, she said. Different how? Clara asked. Better, Ruth said. More lived in a good way. She wrapped her hands around her mug. Mother said it looked like a bachelor's camp. She's revised that opinion. I imagine she's revised several opinions, Clara said with a neutrality that was not quite humor, but was adjacent to it. Ruth had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, and then to let it go. She has, she admitted. She doesn't announce it, but she has. She looked at Clara directly. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. The hemlock, the creek diversion. How did you know it would work? I didn't know for certain, Clara said. But I knew the principle was sound, and the symptoms matched what I'd seen before. Ruth leaned forward slightly. Where did you learn all of this? Is there somewhere you can study it or? From my grandmother, Clara said. And from books. I read everything I could find about agricultural disease, soil chemistry, water systems. My grandmother gave me the practical foundation. The books gave me the vocabulary to understand what she'd taught me. Books, Ruth repeated. Is there a specific? I'll write you a list, Clara said. Ruth looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something close to longing. I'd like that, she said quietly. They talked for another hour, and somewhere in the second half of it, Clara turned the conversation the way a good conversationalist turns a river gradually, without it feeling forced, toward the topic of local history, local landholdings, and then to specific transactions she'd heard had changed hands in the last 5 years. Ruth, who had grown up in Harlow and absorbed its history the way children absorb the air around them, talked freely about what she knew. She talked about the Morrison place, which had sold in a hurry after the family had water trouble. She talked about the old Baxter claim, which Tom Haskell had acquired for a price that people said was less than fair after the Baxters lost their main herd to disease. She talked about the Peters family who had left the valley 18 months ago after a dispute over their property line that had turned expensive. By the time Ruth left, Clara had 3 pages of notes in her notebook and a very clear picture that made her jaw tight with what it implied. She sat at the kitchen table after Ruth's buggy disappeared down the drive and laid it out for Ethan that evening. Morrison, Baxter, Peter, she said. All 3 had water access or strong land positions on the valley's main irrigation feeds. All 3 lost their operations under circumstances that involved either animal loss water disputes or property line challenges. Haskell acquired 2 of the 3, and the third sold to a land company that I think we should find out more about. Ethan had gone still across the table. This isn't opportunism, Clara said. This is a plan. A long one. He's been doing this for years, Ethan said. He said it slowly, working through the implications. And Caldwell Ranch is the last significant piece, Clara said. Your North Creek is the main feed that the others don't control. If he has your land and your water rights, he controls the majority of the valley irrigation access. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then, I need to get to Billings. Yes, Clara said. You need to talk to a land attorney, and you need to bring the title documents, the survey letter, everything. That's 3 days round trip. I know. You'd be here alone. She looked at him steadily. I'm aware of that. He was silent for a moment. Jeb has come by twice more when I was working the south section, he said. I didn't want to worry you. Ethan. Her voice was level and not angry, and left no room for softening. Don't decide what I need to know. He held her gaze. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. She accepted that without making him repeat it. I can manage the ranch for 3 days, she said, and I'm not afraid of Jeb Coker. You should be slightly afraid of Jeb Coker, he said. I'll take it into account, she said. Go to Billings. He rode out the next morning. Clara worked the ranch alone with a composure that she maintained by focusing entirely on each next task and not on the specific feeling of watching Ethan's horse disappear down the north trail. It was not loneliness exactly. She had been alone most of her adult life and understood the difference between solitude and loneliness. This was closer to a sharpened alertness, the awareness of a woman who understood that she was on a piece of land someone else wanted without the one person who made the threat feel manageable. She worked the cattle. She checked the creek channel. She repaired a loose section of garden fence that had been bothering her for a week. She made a point of doing the visible work, the outdoor work, the work that could be seen from the road at the times of day when she was most likely to be observed, because Clara understood that visibility was its own form of protection. Jeb Coker came on the second afternoon. He came up the drive the way he always did, casual, unhurried, with his hat at that angle. Clara was at this garden fence with a hammer when she heard the horse, and she straightened and turned and watched him come, without changing her posture or her expression. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, pulling up. Caldwell around. He's in Billings on business, she said. Something moved in Jeb's expression, just a flicker quickly covered. Billings. How long? He'll be back tomorrow, she said, which was not quite true, since Ethan had said 3 days round trip, but Clara had decided some time ago that precision was not always the most strategic form of honesty. Right. Jeb looked at the garden fence, at the house, at the barn, with the specific inventory of a man cataloging what he saw. "You're managing all right out here." "Very well," she said. "Big place for one person." "I manage," she said. He looked at her with the evaluating attention she'd felt from him before, and there was something in it today that was different from the first time, less casual, more deliberate. "Mr. Haskell wanted me to pass along a message," he said. She waited. "He said to tell you that his original offer for this property still stands. That given the history of the financial situation." He paused, letting that phrase do its work. "The offer is generous, and it won't be on the table indefinitely." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she set her hammer down carefully on the fence post and crossed her arms and said, "Tell Mr. Haskell that Caldwell Ranch is not for sale. It was not for sale before I arrived, and it is considerably less for sale now." She paused. "And tell him that the next time he has something to communicate to us, he can come himself instead of sending someone else. This ranch deserves that much respect at minimum." Jeb stared at her. "Good afternoon, Mr. Coker," she said, and picked up her hammer and turned back to the fence. She heard him sit on his horse for a long moment without moving. Then she heard him turn and go. She drove the next nail with a hand that was steady by will, if not entirely by nature, and she did not watch him leave. That night, alone in the house with the wind beginning to build outside, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and Ethan's account ledger and her own notebook and the growing file of documents they'd been assembling, and she worked through it all again with the methodical attention that her grandmother had called making friends with the truth. She was not afraid of the truth. The truth was that Haskell was organized and patient and had money and connections and had been doing this longer than they'd been paying attention. The truth was that the ranch's financial position, while improving, was still fragile. The truth was that Ethan was in Billings and she was here, and the wind was picking up in a way that the window glass was registering in a tone she didn't like. She went to bed. She woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the wind doing something it wasn't doing before. She was out of bed and to the window before she was fully awake, and what she saw sent her out of the house in her work boots without stopping for anything else. Because the barn roof, the section that had been patched since June, the section Ethan said needed proper attention before winter had lifted. Not fully. Not yet. But the patch tarp was gone, and she could see in the wild light of a cloud-broken moon that a section of original roofing had peeled back at the corner and was flexing in the wind like something trying to decide whether to stay or go. The cattle shelter was under that section. 4 of the recovered animals were in that shelter. Clara ran. She got the barn doors open and went to the animals and got the 4 of them moved to the far stall away from the damaged section before the next gust hit, and the next gust was significant. She heard the roof creak and felt the barn shudder around her and pressed herself against the wall with a horse on either side of her for a moment that she would remember for a long time, the groaning of a structure deciding which way it would go. It held. The corner section flapped and strained, but the main structure held, and Clara stood in the dark of the barn, with her heart loud in her chest, and 4 cattle and 2 horses, pressing their warmth against her, and understood that she had about 20 minutes before the next line of wind came through, and that 20 minutes was not enough time to fully secure the roof, but might be enough time to do something that kept the most critical section from going entirely. She found the ladder in the supply corner. She found the spare tarp that Ethan kept rolled in the back, heavier than the one that had blown off, meant for covering the winter grain. She found the rope. She stood at the bottom of the ladder for exactly as long as it took to understand what she was about to do and why the alternative was worse. Then she climbed. The roof in the wind, at 2 in the morning, was an experience that organized itself into specific physical facts. The noise, which was comprehensive and unrelenting. The way the surface moved under her, not much but enough to feel. The cold, which was a different cold from ground-level cold. And the rope and tarp in her hands that needed to go in specific places for the right reasons if this was going to work. She worked. She wasn't fast. But she was methodical, the way her grandmother had taught her to be, in situations where speed without correctness was just disaster at a higher altitude. She got the tarp positioned, got the first anchor points tied, got the second set, and that was when the second wind line came through. It hit her from the side and she went down flat against the roof and the tarp ripped sideways and her hands were on the rope and she held on with everything she had while the world became pure sound and force, and the specific clarity of the person who understands they cannot afford to fall. The gust passed. She lay flat against the roof for a moment breathing. Then she got back up and finished what she'd started. It took another 20 minutes, and it was imperfect, and it would not hold through a serious storm, but it would hold through this night, which was all that was required of it right now. She climbed back down the ladder with her hands raw from the rope and her arms shaking from the combination of cold and effort and adrenaline, and stood in the barn for a moment with her back against the wall, just breathing. The cattle were quiet. The horses were quiet. The barn around her held. She went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and poured herself the small amount of brandy that Ethan kept in the back of the pantry for medicinal purposes, and she drank it in one swallow and sat with her hands flat on the table, waiting for them to stop shaking. They stopped. She put the glass away and went back to bed. Ethan came back the following afternoon, not the third day, but the second, having found the attorney he needed faster than expected and ridden hard coming home because something in him had not been easy with the distance. He came into the yard and saw her at the barn, and felt the relief of seeing her there upright and working dissolve immediately into the sight of the tarp on the roof. A different tarp secured in a way the old one hadn't been, and the corner section that had been concerning him all summer now lashed down properly. He got off his horse. "What happened?" he said. Clara looked up from the fence board she was reinforcing. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman deciding how to summarize something. "The original patch went in the wind 2 nights ago," she said. "I resecured it." He looked at the roof. He looked at her. "You went up there." "Someone had to." "Clara." He stopped. He started again. "The cattle. Move them to the far stalls before it got bad. They're fine." She turned back to the fence board. "The tarp won't hold through a real storm. We need proper lumber, but it'll hold until you can get it." He stood there looking at her and feeling something large and tangled in his chest that he could not immediately organize into words or even clear thought. She had been here alone. The roof had gone. She had climbed up there in the dark and the wind and fixed it alone, and then come down and gone back to work as though it were simply the next item on the list. "Are you all right?" he said. His voice was rougher than he intended. She glanced at him. "I'm fine." "Clara." He moved closer. "Are you all right?" She stopped working. She turned to face him, and for just a moment, beneath the composure that was her default mode, he saw something that was not fine exactly. Something that was the aftermath of 2 difficult nights alone, of Jeb Coker's visit, of climbing a roof in the wind and holding on. It crossed her face quickly and was gone, but he saw it. "I managed," she said. "I know you managed," he said. "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the ground and said, "It was a hard 2 days." He took her breath. "I should have waited until—" "No." She looked up. "You needed to go." The attorney, what did he say? He recognized the redirect and let her have it because she'd earned that choice. "He says our title is sound," he said. "The property line along the creek is unambiguous, documented and surveyed originally in 1871 when my father filed the claim. The water rights are attached to the land deed. There's no legal basis for a challenge." He paused. He also said the survey from December was almost certainly commissioned by Haskell's attorney, feeling for a weakness that isn't there. Something in Clara's posture released slightly. "Good," she said. "He's also going to look into the Morrison and Baxter transactions," Ethan said. "If there's a pattern, there may be something actionable." Clara nodded. She looked at the roof, then back at him. "We still need the lumber." "I'll go for it Friday." "And the north fence post replacement." "Friday," he said again. She looked at him. Something shifted in the line of her mouth that was not quite a smile, but was from the same region. "You came back a day early," she said. "The attorney was efficient," Ethan said. She looked at him for a moment with those steady brown eyes that had the quality of seeing more than they were given credit for. "Is that the only reason?" she asked. He held her gaze. "No," he said. She looked at him. Then she nodded once, as if he had confirmed something she'd suspected, and turned back to the fence. He stood there for a moment, feeling the particular discomfort of a man who has said an honest thing and not yet learned what to do with the aftermath of it. Then he walked to the barn to see to his horse, and as he passed her she said without looking up, "I'm glad you're back." He stopped for just a moment. "So am I," he said. He went to the barn. That evening after dinner, he told her the rest of what the attorney had told him, not just the good news about the title, but the harder part. The attorney had looked at the mortgage terms and the timeline and the outstanding note and said plainly that even with recovery underway, they were approximately 14 months away from the bank calling the balance. 14 months was enough if the cattle sale in October went well and the spring calving was strong, and there were no major unexpected costs in the winter. No major unexpected costs. Ethan told her this, and watched her face as she received it, the slight tightening around her eyes. That was her version of concern, and then the familiar setting of her jaw. That was her version of decision. "The roof lumber," she said. "Necessary," he said. "If we do it ourselves, your labor, my labor. How much does the lumber cost versus hiring it out?" He ran the numbers. "Maybe $40 in material if we do the work ourselves." "Then we do it ourselves," she said. "That's a week of hard work," he said. "We've had harder," she said without drama, just as a statement of fact. He looked at her across the table. 2 months ago, she had arrived on a platform in a town that laughed at her. She had been here 9 weeks now. 9 weeks of harder work than most people did in a year of solving problems nobody had asked her to solve, of holding this ranch together with her hands and her knowledge, and a patience that he no longer took for granted. "Clara," he said. She looked up from the ledger. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." She set her pencil down. "All right. Do you regret coming here?" She looked at him for a long, still moment. The lamp was between them, throwing light across the table, across the papers, and the ledger, and the 2 coffee cups, and the accumulated evidence of 2 people working toward the same thing. "No," she said. She said it simply, without decoration, with the completeness of a word that was sufficient on its own. Then she picked up her pencil. "Do you regret asking me to come?" I thought about it honestly the way she deserved. He thought about the platform at Harlow Station, about the crowd watching, about the disappointment he had felt, and then been ashamed of, and then entirely forgotten. Somewhere between the creek bank and a barn roof at 2 in the morning, and 14 months of viable timeline spread across the kitchen table. "No," he said. She nodded. She went back to the ledger. Outside, the wind had died down to something ordinary, and the ranch was quiet around them, with the settling quiet of a late September night, and the lamp burned between them while they worked, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and neither of them needed to. But something had been named. Not everything. Not the full shape of it. Just the beginning. The part where 2 people stopped pretending that what was happening between them was only practical, only necessary, only about saving a ranch. It was about that. It was also about something more. Neither of them was ready to say the more, but both of them knew it was there, sitting quietly in the space between the ledger and the lamp, patient, in the way that real things are patient, waiting for the moment when both people would be ready to look at it directly. That moment had not come yet, but it was coming. And the ranch was still standing. And so were they. The barn roof took 6 days, not a week. Clara had estimated the work with the same precision she brought to everything, and on the 6th afternoon, Ethan drove the last nail into the final board and climbed down the ladder and stood back and looked at what they had built together. It was not elegant. It was not the work of a professional carpenter. But it was solid, properly joined, correctly angled to shed the weight of a Montana winter, and it would last. He knew it would last the way you know a thing when you've put every hour of it in with your own hands. Clara came and stood beside him and looked at it. "Good," she said. That was all. But the way she said it, with that quiet finality that meant she was genuinely satisfied and not performing satisfaction for his benefit, made it enough. October arrived the following week, and with it the cattle buyer from Billings, a weathered man named Aldous Price, who had been making this circuit through the valley for 15 years, and who greeted Ethan with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned that no expression was more profitable than an unreadable one. He walked the herd. He looked at the 6 animals Ethan had selected for sale, the ones with the longest contamination exposure, the ones who had recovered fully, but who would take another season to reach their peak productivity. He looked at them with the evaluating eye of a man who understood cattle the way Clara understood soil. And then he walked back to where Ethan and Clara were standing, and he named a price. It was lower than Ethan had hoped by $12 a head, Clara said before Ethan could respond. "Mr. Price, look at those animals again." Price looked at her with the mild surprise of a man who was not accustomed to being addressed by the rancher's wife on price. "They've been sick," Clara said, "and they've recovered. I understand that's a discount factor, but they recovered fully, which means their body condition is sound, their weight is appropriate for their age, and the underlying issue, which was water contamination, now completely resolved, is gone. You're not buying sick cattle. You're buying recovered cattle on a ranch with a clean water source and improving range condition. The difference is worth more than $12 a head." Price looked at the cattle again. Then he looked at Clara with an expression that was recalibrating. $8, he said. "10, she said. Price looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Clara. He said nothing. Price made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a concession and said, 10, and they shook hands and the deal was done. When Price rode out with the 6 animals and a bank draft that was $60 better than the original offer. Ethan stood at the gate and watched him go and said, "You negotiated better than I would have." "You would have taken the first number," Clara said, not unkindly. "Yes," he said. "You worked too hard for $12 a head to disappear without a fight," she said. He turned and looked at her. She was watching the retreating cattle with the composed expression of a woman who had done what needed doing and was already thinking about the next thing. The afternoon light was doing something to the angle of her face that he was aware of. In a way, he had been increasingly aware of things about her that had nothing to do with the ranch. He looked away. "The money goes to the north fence replacement," he said. "And 40 toward the account balance," she said. "I've already figured it." He smiled. He had started doing that more, smiling and not pressing it back. "Of course you have," he said. She glanced at him with something in her expression that was warm and brief, and quickly returned to neutral, but he had seen it. They walked back to the house together. The letter arrived 3 days later. It came with the regular mail delivery from Harlow brought out by the postman's boy, who left it on the porch without knocking. The way things were delivered to a ranch where someone was always somewhere outside. Clara found it first. She brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table and looked at the return address, Harlow land title, and did not open it because it was addressed to Ethan. When Ethan came in for dinner, he saw it immediately. He saw her face, which was composed in the specific way it was composed when she was controlling a reaction rather than not having one. He picked up the letter. He read it standing at the table, and as he read it, Clara watched his face move through something that began as confusion and arrived at a hard, cold anger that she recognized as the most dangerous version of Ethan's anger because it was the quiet kind. He set the letter down. "What does it say?" she asked, even though she could see most of it from the posture alone. "Harlow land title has received an application for survey review," he said. His voice was flat. "They're requesting that I appear at their office within 30 days to discuss what they're calling an unresolved question regarding the original boundary filing on the North Creek section." He looked at her. "It's Haskell." "Yes," she said. "He's found a way to force a formal proceeding, even though the attorney in Billings said the title is sound." "The title being sound doesn't prevent someone from challenging it," she said. "It just means they'll lose when it's examined. But the process itself costs money," Ethan said, "and time, and creates enough uncertainty that a bank with a note outstanding might get nervous," Clara finished. They looked at each other across the table. "He's not trying to win the legal challenge," Clara said slowly. "He's trying to create enough instability that the bank calls the note early. If they call it before October of next year, you can't meet it. And then the property goes to auction," Ethan said. and Haskell buys it for whatever he wants to pay. The silence in the kitchen had a particular quality, not panic, but the crystalline clarity of two people who have just seen the full shape of the problem they are dealing with. "We need to go to Harlow tomorrow," Clara said. "The title office." "And Gerald Cross," she said. "And May Patterson, and Ruth Hale." Ethan looked at her. "Why?" "Because Haskell's power is social as much as legal," she said. "He operates through the town's perception of situations. If the town believes this ranch is in legitimate trouble, that perception makes his position stronger. If the town understands what's actually happening." She stopped. "Does anyone in Harlow actually like Tom Haskell?" Ethan thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "He's respected. Some people are afraid of him, but liked." He paused. "No. Then people may be waiting for someone to say out loud what they've been thinking privately," Clara said. "We need to go to Harlow." The title office in Harlow was a single room at the back of the land registry building, managed by a man named Horatio Wells, who was precise, careful, and deeply uncomfortable with conflict. He was also honest, which was the relevant fact. Ethan and Clara arrived at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday, which was the quietest day at the registry. Clara had suggested the timing. Ethan hadn't asked why, and had come to understand that when Clara suggested a specific timing, there was a reason for it. Wells looked at them with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and was not looking forward to it. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "please sit down." "Mr. Wells," Clara said, sitting without being told to, "we've received your letter regarding the boundary survey review. We'd like to understand the basis of the application." Wells shuffled papers. "A third party has raised a question regarding the original 1871 filing, specifically the designation of the creek's center line as the boundary marker, and whether subsequent creek movement has altered the practical." "The creek has not moved," Ethan said. "I'm not saying it has," Wells said quickly. "I'm saying that a question has been formally raised and the office is obligated to." "Mr. Wells," Clara said, and her voice was quiet and direct and completely controlled. "Who filed this application?" Wells looked at her. He looked at his papers. He looked at the window. "The application was filed by an attorney representing a private interest," he said carefully. "Haskell's attorney," Ethan said. Wells did not deny it. "We have the original filing documents," Clara said. She opened the satchel she had brought and set papers on his desk. "The 1871 deed, the original survey map, the boundary documentation, all of it organized in the order that made the picture clearest. We also have a legal opinion from an attorney in Billings here, stating that the title is unambiguous and the boundary designation is sound." She set that letter on top. "We're happy to cooperate with any formal review process. We're asking that the process be conducted on the actual evidence rather than on the basis of—" She paused. "A strategically timed application." Wells looked at the pile of documents. He looked at the legal opinion letter. Something in his posture shifted in the direction of relief, as though someone had just made it easier for him to do the thing he had already believed was right. "The review process is 30 days, he said. "I can tell you now informally that the documentation you've provided is strong. I will conduct the review, but—" He lowered his voice slightly. "I can tell you that applications of this kind have been filed before in this valley. The outcomes have not always served the people who filed them." Ethan looked at him. "How many times have you seen this pattern, Mr. Wells?" Wells looked at his desk for a moment. "This is the 4th time in 5 years," he said, "that I've received an application of this type regarding a property with creek access." He said it carefully with the precision of a man going right up to the line of what he was willing to say officially. "I note that fact for the record." Clara picked up her pen and wrote something in her notebook. They left the title office and went directly across the street to Gerald Cross's feed store. Gerald looked up when they came in with the expression of a man bracing for weather. "Ethan, Clara." "Gerald," Ethan said. "We need to talk about something, and we need you to listen before you say anything." Gerald set down what he was holding. They told him. Not everything. Not the full legal detail, but the shape of it. Haskell's patterned the previous properties, the formal challenge that was designed not to succeed, but to destabilize. Ethan told it plainly. Clara added the specific names Morrison, Baxter, Peters, and what had happened to each of them. Gerald's expression moved through several stages. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had been comfortable not connecting dots that had been available to connect. Morrison left because of the water dispute, he said slowly. That was... Haskell's attorney filed a water rights challenge 3 months before the Morrison sold, Clara said. We believe the pattern is consistent. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. I knew Carl Morrison for 20 years, he said. He said it to the middle distance, not to either of them. Then he looked at Ethan. What do you need? For now, Clara said. Just for people to know what's happening. Not rumor, not gossip, the facts. Gerald nodded slowly. I know people, he said. He looked at Clara with an expression that had changed considerably from the expression he'd had the last time she'd been in this store. You've been good for this ranch, he said. I should have said that sooner. You're saying it now, Clara said. That's enough. May Patterson was their last stop. She was at her stall in the market square, and when she saw them coming, she folded her arms in the posture of a woman who had been waiting and was ready. Clara had spoken to her briefly the previous Saturday, and May Patterson, who had lived in Harlow since before most of its current residents were born, and who had a memory like a ledger and a sense of justice, like a level line, had spent the intervening days thinking. The Peters family, May said before either of them could speak. I knew what happened to them. I just didn't know what to call it. She looked at Clara. You're calling it something now. We're documenting it, Clara said, and making sure the right people understand the pattern. May looked at Ethan. Your father was a good man, she said. He built that ranch on honest work. I watched him do it. She looked back at Clara. What can I do? Clara told her. They drove home in the early afternoon, with the particular quietness of two people who have done something that cannot be undone and who are now waiting to see what it becomes. Ethan drove. Clara sat with her notebook closed for once, hands in her lap. You've been planning that since Ruth's visit, he said. Since the letter arrived, she said. Ruth gave me the names. The letter gave me the timeline. You knew Wells would tell us the number of previous applications. I hoped he would, she said. Honest bureaucrats usually will, if you give them a reason to be honest without requiring them to be brave. He thought about that. And Gerald May. People don't usually help because they're brave, Clara said. They help because someone finally made it easy to do the right thing. We just made it easy. He drove for a while in the quiet. Then, my father used to say that the hardest battles are the ones where you're fighting alone. Clara looked at him. He meant it as a warning, Ethan said. About pride, about asking for help. He paused. I didn't listen until... He stopped. Until you had to, she said. Not unkindly. Until you, he said. She was quiet for a moment. He felt her looking at him with the particular attention she gave things she was examining carefully. Ethan, she said. He looked at her. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without doing that thing you do where you argue against a compliment before it finishes landing. He blinked. What thing? The thing where you deflect, she said. You've been doing it since I arrived. Someone says something that's true and generous about you and you. She made a small gesture. You redirect it. To the ranch, or to the work, or to your father. He didn't say anything for a moment. What did you want to tell me? She looked at the road ahead. You saved this ranch, she said. Not by giving up, and not by selling, and not by disappearing into grief when you had every reason to. You held on for 2 years on your own, and you were still holding on when I got here. That is not nothing. She paused. I want you to know that I see that. The words landed in a way that was different from the way most words landed. He felt them in this specific place where he kept the things he had been carrying without examining the grief and the stubbornness and the shame and the 2 years of choosing the land over the easier thing. He didn't deflect. He said, thank you. She nodded and looked at the road. He looked at her. The thing he'd been not looking at directly for weeks was looking back at him now from very close range, and he understood what it was with the clarity of a man who has been avoiding a truth until the moment when the truth simply will not wait anymore. He loved her. Not the arriving convenient version of love, not the gratitude dressed as love that he'd worried about in his more honest moments. Something real and specific, the love for the particular person who climbed a barn roof in a windstorm alone and didn't make it a story. Who negotiated $60 better price per head without raising her voice. Who asked May Patterson to help and made it easy for May Patterson to say yes. Who had sat across this wagon seat every morning for 2 months and been exactly, consistently, unperformingly herself. He loved her. He didn't say it. The moment was not ready for it, and he knew enough now to understand the difference between a moment that was ready and a moment that needed more time. But he stopped not knowing it. He let it sit in his chest with the quiet permanence of something that had already been decided. He drove them home. 3 days later, Tom Haskell came to the ranch himself. He came alone, which was either a gesture of respect or an acknowledgement that the time for intermediaries was done. He rode up the drive on a Tuesday morning when the sky had the low gray quality that said October was finishing its transition and winter was not joking anymore. Ethan was at the barn. Clara was at the house. She saw Haskell first. She came out to the yard and stood there. And when Ethan heard the horse and came out of the barn, she was already positioned in a way that made it clear she was not going inside. The three of them formed a kind of triangle in the yard, Haskell on his horse, Ethan and Clara on foot close enough together that the closeness was its own statement. "Caldwell," Haskell said. He looked at Clara. "Mrs. Caldwell." He said it differently than Jeb had said it, without the sneer. "Haskell," Ethan said. Haskell dismounted. He was a big man heavy through the shoulders, and he moved with the deliberate ease of a man who had learned that size was a language. He looked at the barn roof, the new one, and at the fence lines, and at the cattle visible on the north range, and his expression moved through something that was not quite readable. "I want to speak plainly," he said. "Go ahead," Ethan said. "I understand there's been some history reviewed," Haskell said, "regarding previous land transactions in the valley." He looked at Clara when he said it. "And that certain people in town have been made aware of certain patterns." "That's accurate," Clara said. Haskell looked at her for a long moment. It was not the look he'd given her in the market when he was evaluating the threat level. This was a look that had gone past evaluation into something more like acceptance. "You're smarter than I accounted for," he said. "Most people are," Clara said, "if you account for them by their appearance." Something moved in Haskell's jaw. Not anger, something more complicated. "The title challenge will be withdrawn," he said. Ethan went very still. "I'm withdrawing the application," Haskell said. "The review will not proceed." Silence in the yard. Ethan looked at him. "Why?" Haskell was quiet for a moment. He looked at the barn roof again. He looked at the north range. He looked at the creek channel, the new section visible from where they stood. He looked at all the evidence of a ranch that was not dying anymore, and had not been dying for some time. "Because this is going to cost me more than it's worth," he said. Not with grace, but with the honesty of a man making a calculation and being straightforward about it. "Wells told me privately that the documentation you provided is thorough. Gerald Cross has been having conversations with people I'd rather he not have conversations with. And..." He paused. "The Morrison family has apparently been in communication with an attorney in Helena about the terms of their sale." Clara did not look at Ethan, but he felt her not looking at him. "You did that," he said to her quietly. "May Patterson knew where they'd gone," she said just as quietly. Haskell looked between them. "There will be no further interference with Caldwell Ranch," he said. He said it with the formality of a man making a statement he intended to be remembered. "The water rights are yours. The boundary is yours." He picked up his reins. "I overestimated the situation's momentum. You underestimated the people in it," Clara said. Haskell looked at her. The long look of a man recalibrating a world that had turned out to be different from the one he had built his plans inside. "Yes," he said. "I did." He mounted. He rode out. Ethan and Clara stood in the yard and watched him go, and neither of them said anything for a full minute after the sound of hooves faded. Then Ethan said, "The Morrison family. May had an address," Clara said. "I wrote to them 3 weeks ago. I told them what we were finding and suggested they speak to an attorney about the circumstances of their sale." 3 weeks ago, he said. He turned to look at her. "You were 3 moves ahead of where I thought we were." "You were in the barn," she said simply. He looked at her, at this woman who had arrived 9 weeks ago, unwanted on a platform in a small Montana town, and had spent those 9 weeks dismantling every threat and rebuilding every broken thing on a piece of land she had no obligation to fight for and had fought for anyway with everything she had, without complaint, without drama, without asking for credit. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. He understood this moment was ready. "I need to say something to you, and I need you to let me finish it before you redirect it to the ledger, or the fence line, or the cattle count." Something shifted in her expression, a slight opening, a careful attention. "When you arrived," he said, "I stood on that platform and I felt I was wrong. About what I was looking at. About what I was seeing." He stopped, started again. "I stood there, and I saw a woman who wasn't what I expected, and I let that be the whole picture, and I was wrong in a way I'm ashamed of." He held her gaze. "I need you to know that I know that." She didn't say anything. She was listening in the full-body way she listened when something mattered to her. "And I need you to know," he said, "that what I see now when I look at you is the truest, clearest thing I've seen in years. You are the best thing on this land. Not because of what you've done for it, though you have done everything. Because of who you are." He stopped. "I love you, Clara." The yard was quiet around them. The cattle moved on the north range. The new barn roof caught the gray October light. Clara looked at him for a long moment. That was not hesitation. It was the full attention receiving of something important. Her jaw moved once. Her eyes were bright in a way that he understood was her version of the feeling that would have broken his voice if he'd let it. "I know," she said. He blinked. "I've known for a while," she said. "I was waiting for you to catch up." He stared at her. Then something broke loose in his chest that felt remarkably like laughter, the first deep, genuine laugh he had produced in longer than he could measure, coming up from somewhere real and relieved and grateful. Clara's face opened into a smile, a full one, unguarded the smile she didn't usually show, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen on his father's land since his father had been alive on it. "And you," he said when he could. "Clara, do you?" "Yes," she said, before he could finish it. "Obviously, yes." He took one step toward her, and she met him in the middle, the way she always met things directly, without waiting, without pretending the distance was larger than it was. He held her there in the yard of the ranch his father had built with the winter coming, and the cattle safe, and the title secure, and the barn roof solid overhead, and he held her the way a man holds something he almost lost before he understood what he had. And she held him back with the same arms that had pulled hemlock roots out of clay soil and secured a tarp on a roof in a windstorm and written numbers in a brown notebook by lamplight until the problem became solvable. 2 people in a yard, a ranch that was still standing, and something between them that had been growing quietly in the space between the practical and the necessary until it had become the most essential thing on the land. That evening, they sat on the porch after dinner. Something they had never done before, the sitting without a purpose. Just the sitting, and the cold was the kind of October cold that smelled like the season changing for good, and the stars were coming out above the mountains, the way they did when the air cleared. Ethan had his hands around a coffee cup. Clara had her notebook in her lap, but she wasn't writing in it. After a while she said, "We'll need to buy the breeding stock before February." "I know," he said. "And the spring planting needs to be decided by January at the latest." "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "Can we just sit here for a minute?" She looked at him. Then she looked at the mountains. Then she closed the notebook and set it aside and sat there beside him in the October evening without an agenda. After a while she said quietly, "My grandmother would have liked this land. I think she'd have liked you being on it, he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, she used to say that home isn't the place you come from. It's the place where you do your best work among people who see you clearly. He let that settle. Is this home? He asked. She looked at him, at this man who had fumbled the welcome and given her creek contamination and a leaking barn roof and a land dispute and 14 months of financial pressure, who had come back from Billings a day early because something in him hadn't been easy with the distance, who had stood in this yard this afternoon and said what he meant without deflecting. Yes, she said. She picked up the notebook again. Now, about the breeding stock. He laughed. She did, too quiet and real, and the sound of it went out into the October dark, where the mountains held it a moment before the night took it back. The ranch was alive around them, and so were they. The breeding stock arrived on a Thursday morning in late November, 6 young heifers and a bull from a reputable operation outside of Missoula that Clara had researched with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. 3 letters sent, 2 responses evaluated. 1 decision made on the basis of documented health records and verified bloodline productivity. Ethan stood at the gate and watched them come off the transport wagon and felt something he had not felt in a very long time standing on this land. He felt proud. Not the brittle defensive pride of a man holding on to something while it crumbles. The genuine grounded pride of a man who is building something that is getting better. Clara was beside him with her notebook, counting the animals as they came through, checking each one against the description they'd been given, making notes. She always had the notebook. He had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the essential things that simply belong in a picture. The bull's in better condition than the description suggested, she said. Good, he said. The 3rd heifer has some stiffness in the left rear leg. I want to watch her for a few days before I decide whether it's travel stress or something structural. You'll figure it out, he said. She glanced at him with the look that meant she'd caught the confidence in his voice and had received it and was not going to make a display of it. Probably, she said, and turned back to her notebook. The herd stood now at 29. In the spring, with normal calving from the original recovered animals and the new stock integrating well, they were looking at 35 to 40 by June. Clara had run the numbers so many times she could recite them without the ledger. Ethan had stopped doubting the numbers sometime around the 3rd week of October. He was not sure when exactly he had crossed from hoping she was right to simply knowing she was, but the crossing had happened. The winter settled in properly the 2nd week of December. The kind of Montana winter that had announced itself without apology. Hard, cold, significant snow. The particular quality of silence that a landscape makes when everything in it has accepted the season and stopped fighting. The ranch held against it the way a well-built thing holds against what it was built for. The barn roof did not move. The cattle shelter was solid. The food stores Clara had begun accumulating in October dried goods, root vegetables from the garden grain hay reserves that she had calculated down to the week, proved sufficient, and then some. They fell into the rhythms of winter work, which were different from the rhythms of the other seasons, slower in some ways, more interior, more dependent on the close company of the house and the barn and each other. It was in the 2nd week of December that Ethan's father's letter arrived. Not the first letter Ethan had told Clara about that one. The letter from the Bozeman hospital that had led to the decision to write to the agency. This was a new letter written in the shaky hand of a man who was using more effort than the result showed, and it was brief. His father was still alive, which had been uncertain enough through October and November that each piece of mail from Bozeman had carried its own weight before being opened. Howe was still alive, and he wanted to come to the ranch. Not permanently. Not an imposition. The letter was specific about that, in the way of a proud man who could not stop being careful about being a burden, even from a hospital bed. Just a visit. Before winter closed the roads completely. Just to see the land again. Just to the letter said this without saying it directly, meet the woman his son had married. Ethan read the letter at the kitchen table, and then set it down, and looked at Clara. She was at the stove, and had already understood from the quality of his silence that this was significant. She turned around. My father, he said. He wants to visit. She looked at him steadily. Then we should make sure the guest room is ready, she said. He looked at her. You don't know him. "No," she said. "But I know that you want him to come, and that you're afraid of something about it, and that you've been carrying both of those things since you opened that envelope." He didn't deny it. He stopped, started again. He had opinions about the way things should look. The ranch, a rancher's wife. He's not a cruel man. He's just from his time, Clara said. Not as an excuse, just as a fact. Yes. He looked at the letter. He may say things that... Ethan! Her voice was gentle and completely firm. Your father is coming from a hospital bed to see his son's land and his son's life. Let him come. Whatever he thinks when he gets here, we'll handle it. His father arrived 4 days later in a wagon hired from Harlow, driven by the doctor from Bozeman, who had apparently decided that the patient's insistence on this visit was more dangerous to manage than the visit itself. William Caldwell was 71 years old and looked like the last year had taken a decade from him, but he came off that wagon without assistance and stood in the yard of the ranch he'd built with the expression of a man arriving at a place that existed inside him more than anywhere else. Ethan shook his father's hand, and then, in the way of men who have been taught that embraces require occasions, held on to that handshake for a moment longer than necessary. The barn roof, his father said, looking. New, Ethan said. October. His father looked at the fence lines, at the cattle visible on the range, at the state of the yard cleared, maintained not the organized chaos of a man fighting alone, but the purposeful order of a working operation. You've been busy, his father said. We've been busy, Ethan said. His father turned. Clara was standing at the porch steps. She had not dressed differently than she normally dressed. She had not adjusted anything about herself for this arrival, which Ethan had noticed, and which had made him love her more specifically in that moment than he had yet managed to articulate. She stood there in her work dress, with her hands at her sides, and looked at William Caldwell with the direct, courteous attention she brought to every person she met, until they gave her a reason for something else. William Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had been raised in a time when a man's wife was a reflection of his standing, when appearance was not vanity, but communication, when the world made judgments that had consequences, and you dressed and married accordingly. He was a man with those beliefs built into him, the way timber is built into a structure not visible on the surface, but load-bearing. He looked at Clara. He looked at the barn roof. He looked at the fence lines. He looked back at Clara. You're the one who sorted out the water, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Clara said. And the roof. She paused. We did the roof together. William looked at his son. Ethan said nothing. Come inside, Clara said. You've been traveling in the cold. There's food on. William Caldwell came inside. He stayed 4 days. The first day was careful. The particular careful of two people, measuring the distance between their understandings of the world. William asked questions, and Clara answered them without embellishment and without apology. He asked about her grandmother, and she told him. He asked about the hemlock, and she explained it in terms that assumed he was intelligent, which he was, and he listened in the way of a man who was recalibrating something significant. On the second day, he asked to walk the fence lines. Ethan went with him. Clara did not because she wasn't invited, but because she understood that this was something that needed to happen between a father and a son, and she had the particular social intelligence to know which spaces to leave open. She stayed at the ranch and worked, and when they came back 3 hours later, William was walking slightly slower than he'd left, and his face had the expression of a man who has had an important conversation and is still absorbing it. He came to the kitchen where Clara was at the table working on the spring planting plan. He stood in the doorway for a moment. My son tells me, he said, that you identified the water problem on the first day. Clara looked up. It took most of the first evening, she said. We confirmed it together. He says you went up on the barn roof alone in a storm. The cattle shelter was underneath, she said. Someone had to. William was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that was difficult for him. She could see that it was difficult. Could see the effort of a proud man crossing from the world he'd built his assumptions in to the world that actually existed. I'm glad he wrote to that agency, he said. I'm glad you came. Clara looked at him. She said, Your son held this land alone for 2 years when most men would have walked away. Whatever I've added, he was still here when I arrived. That matters more than anything." William Caldwell looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has just been given something generous and is not quite sure he deserves it. "You're a good woman," he said. "I try to be," she said. "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell. The coffee's still hot." He sat down. On the morning of the 4th day, when the doctor had come back to take William to Bozeman before the roads worsened, William stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and looked at everything one more time. He was doing the thing old men do when they look at a place they love and are honest with themselves about probability, counting it, storing it, making sure they have it completely. He turned to Ethan. "You got it figured out," he said, "meaning more than the ranch." "Getting there," Ethan said. His father looked at Clara. "Take care of my boy," he said. Then before she could answer, "Though I suspect he's in competent hands." Clara smiled. "I'll do my best, Mr. Caldwell." He left. Ethan stood in the yard until the wagon was out of sight, and then he stood there for another few minutes, not moving. Clara stood beside him and did not try to fill the silence. After a while he said, "He approved of you." "I know," she said. "He doesn't approve of things easily." "I could tell," she said. "That's what made it mean something." He turned and looked at her. His father had come and gone. The ranch was solid beneath the winter. The herd was safe in the shelter they'd reinforced together. And this woman was standing beside him in the December cold, with her hands in her coat pockets and her face turned into the wind, with the equanimity of someone who had decided this was her place and intended to keep it. He reached over and took her hand. She looked at him. He said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. She turned her hand and held his back. They went inside. January brought 2 things that arrived within the same week and changed the character of the winter entirely. The first was a letter from the attorney in Billings. The Morrison family's case had been reviewed by a Helena attorney who had found sufficient grounds to pursue a claim against the land company that had acquired their property. The same land company that Ethan and Clara had suspected was connected to Haskell. The investigation had widened. The Territorial Land Office in Helena was now involved. Tom Haskell had been formally requested to provide documentation regarding 3 separate property transactions. The letter was careful and legal in its language, but its meaning was clear. The pattern Clara had documented, and May Patterson had corroborated, and Ruth Hale had helped trace, was now in the hands of people with authority. Ethan read it twice and then set it on the table in front of Clara. She read it once. "May's going to want to know," she said. "I'll ride in tomorrow," he said. "Gerald too," she said. "He took a risk talking to the people he talked to. He should know it mattered." "You think about people," Ethan said. He meant it as an observation, but it came out as something closer to wonder. She looked at him. "Don't you?" "I think about the land," he said honestly. "And the cattle, and the work. People." He paused. "I've been better at it since you came." She looked at him with the expression that was warm and composed, and entirely real. "People are just another kind of system," she said. "They respond to what's around them. If you give them honesty and treat them like they're capable of doing the right thing, most of them will." "Haskell didn't," he said. "No," she agreed. "But he also didn't win." The second thing that arrived that week was a visitor. Ethan had not expected, and Clara had not known to expect. Her name was Dorothea Price, the wife of Aldous Price the cattle buyer, and she arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in a buggy driven by her son, carrying a basket covered with cloth and the purposeful energy of a woman on a mission that she had been planning for some time. Dorothea Price was 63 years old, broad-shouldered and direct, and she had apparently decided after her husband's report of the October cattle sale, and specifically of Clara's negotiation, that she needed to meet Clara Caldwell in person. She sat at the kitchen table with coffee and looked at Clara with the frank measuring attention of a woman who did not have time for anything less than reality. "My husband says you argued him up $10 a head," she said. "He settled at 10, Clara said. "I started higher." Dorothea laughed, a genuine full sound that filled the kitchen. "He told me that too." She set down her cup. I want to ask you about something. The hemlock identification. Aldous told me the whole story. I want to know if you'd be willing to come out to the Peterson place with me in February. Clara looked at her. What's wrong at the Peterson place? Mary Peterson has been losing poultry for 3 months, and nobody can tell her why. The birds aren't sick in any way the local men recognize. They die slow, then stop eating then. She stopped. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? It might be, Clara said carefully. Or it might be something else entirely. But I can come and look. I told Mary about you, Dorothea said. She wants someone to look who'll actually look. Ethan had been listening from the doorway. He said nothing. He watched Clara receive this, the being sought out, the being considered the person who knew something worth knowing, and he watched how she received it. Not with pride, with something quieter and more solid. With the satisfaction of a woman who had always known what she was capable of, and was glad finally to be in a place where that capability had room. Tell her I'll come in February, Clara said. Dorothea Price left 2 hours later, having consumed 2 cups of coffee and covered more conversational ground than most people managed in a full day. She had also, before she left, pressed Clara's hand between both of hers, with the warmth of a woman who recognized something in another woman that she respected and was not going to leave without saying so. Harlow was sleeping when you arrived, she said. You woke it up. Clara looked faintly surprised. I just worked, she said. That's how waking up happens, Dorothea said, and got into her buggy. Ethan closed the door after she left and turned to find Clara standing in the middle of the kitchen with an expression that was somewhere between undone and composed, trying to decide which one was going to win. She's right, he said. Don't, Clara said. I'm going to, he said. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who knows she's about to receive something she's not entirely sure how to hold. When you walked off that train, he said, I stood there, and I was wrong about everything I thought I was looking at. You know that. I told you that. But there's something I haven't said, which is that every single person in this valley who has met you since then has been wrong about the same thing and has had to revise themselves in the same way. He paused. And they're better for it. Gerald's been kinder. Ruth's been braver. May Patterson sent a letter to the Morrison family on her own before you even knew she'd done it. Dorothea Price drove out here in January because she trusts the judgment of a woman she met twice. He looked at her steadily. That's not just working. That's what you bring with you everywhere you go. Clara was very quiet. Her jaw had the particular set of someone who is not going to cry in front of another person and is deploying considerable resources in service of that decision. My grandmother used to say, she said, finally, her voice even and deliberate, that a person plants seeds their whole life without knowing which ones will grow. That you do the right thing in the right way as many times as you can, and you trust the soil. She looked at him. She was the soil for me. I'm trying to be what she was. You are, he said. On your own terms, which is the only way it counts. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, picked up her coffee cup. February, she said. The Peterson poultry. I'll drive you, he said. The visit to the Peterson place happened on a clear February morning when the cold was the kind that turned breath to vapor and made every sound carry farther than it should. Mary Peterson was a small, tired woman who had been fighting her poultry losses alone for 3 months and who looked at Clara with the desperate hope of someone who had run out of other options. Clara spent 2 hours at the Peterson place. She walked the coops, examined the dead birds, 2 that Mary had kept frozen, knowing without being told that evidence mattered, and walked the property with the focused attention that was entirely her own, the looking without assumptions that her grandmother had built into her over 20 years of patient instruction. She found it in the feed storage shed. Molded grain. Not obviously, not visibly, not the kind of mold a person would notice in a quick look. The kind that grew in the lower corner of an improperly ventilated storage bin over months of cold, damp weather, invisible to someone who wasn't looking for it and hadn't been taught what looking for it required. Clara crouched in that shed for a long time. She stood up and went to find Mary. Your grain storage has a moisture problem, she said. The mold is producing something toxic, not to humans in small doses but to poultry, It accumulates in their system over weeks. She paused. If you replace the grain now and repair the ventilation in the shed before you store again, you'll stop losing birds. Mary stared at her. That's it, she said. That's it, Clara said. Mary Peterson sat down on a fence rail and put her face in her hands, not from sadness, but from the particular release of 3 months of fear and grief and confusion. Finding its resolution in something so simple, it felt like being cheated and rescued at the same time. Clara sat beside her and waited. After a while, Mary said, "How do you know these things?" "My grandmother taught me," Clara said, "and I paid attention." "I want to learn," Mary said. "Would you?" She stopped. "That's too much to ask." "It's not," Clara said. They sat on that fence rail for another hour, and Clara talked, and Mary listened. And when Ethan finally came around the corner of the shed, wondering where they'd gotten to, he found 2 women sitting in the February cold, absorbed in a conversation that had the quality of something important being passed from one person to another. He went back to the wagon and waited. On the drive home, Clara was quiet for a long while. Not the quiet of something wrong, but the quiet of someone full. "You're going to do this regularly," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "If people ask," she said. "They'll ask," he said. She looked at him. Is it all right with you, the time away from the ranch?" "Clara," he stopped her. "This is what you're for. Not the ranch. You. The ranch benefits from it, and I benefit from it, and every person in this valley who gets to have you look at their problem and figure it out benefits from it." He kept his eyes on the road. "Don't make yourself smaller than you are, because you're worried about the proportion of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother would tell you the same thing," he said. She looked out at the winter landscape moving past. "She would," she said softly. "She'd tell me to stop standing in my own way and just do the work." "Smart woman," Ethan said. "The best I knew," Clara said. Spring came the way. It always came in Montana, not gently, not all at once, but in the provisional way of a season that reserves the right to change its mind. The cattle came through the winter with losses that were acceptable, and no worse 2 calves that didn't make it one older animal that had never fully recovered from the contamination year, and who they had known going in was the most fragile. 26 animals alive, healthy and moving into the spring with the energy of a herd that had a functioning home. The calving season started the first week of April. It was the most sustained, exhausting, and strangely joyful work Ethan had done in years. Clara was beside him for every one of them, the births that went smoothly, and the ones that didn't. The nights when they were both up at 2 and 4 and 6, watching an animal that needed watching, the mornings when a new calf stood for the first time on uncertain legs, and both of them stood watching it with the same quiet satisfaction, shoulder to shoulder, not needing to say what they were both feeling. By the end of April, they had 8 new calves. 8. When Ethan had started the fall with 23 animals. They were at 34 head. By summer, they would hit 38, maybe 40. He stood in the south pasture on a morning in late April and counted them. Actually counted out loud, something he had not wanted to do for 2 years, because the number had always been going the wrong direction, and when he reached 34, he stood there for a moment with the number sitting in him like something solid. Clara came up beside him. She'd been counting too, he knew. She always was. 34, he said. 34, she agreed. He turned to look at her. 1 year ago, I was watching animals die and didn't know why. I know, she said. 1 year ago, you were in Tennessee, he said. She looked at him with the expression that was warm and steady and unguarded in the way it was only ever unguarded with him. I know that too. I thought about everything that had happened in the space between those 2 facts. The platform at Harlow Station. The creek bank at dusk. The hemlock roots in the clay. The barn roof in the wind. Haskell in the yard. His father's hand in his. The sound of Clara's laugh in the October dark. February on a fence rail with Mary Peterson. 8 calves in the spring mud. A whole life compressed into 1 year conducted on a piece of land that had decided to survive. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked at him with the full attention she always gave things that mattered. "When my father wrote to me the first letter, he said the land doesn't care how proud you are." He paused. I didn't understand that yet. I thought he meant I should be humble about what I couldn't control. But I think he meant something different. I think he meant that the land is honest. It shows you exactly what is and what isn't working. And pride is the thing that keeps you from seeing what you need to see. Clara was quiet, listening. "You're the most honest thing that's come onto this land," he said. "You were honest about the creek when I would have kept looking the wrong direction. Honest about Haskell when I was managing it alone. Honest about what we could do and what it would take and what it was worth." He looked at her. "Honest about what you felt, which made it possible for me to be honest about what I felt." She was very still. "I want to say something in front of all of this," he said. He meant the land, the cattle, the spring, the sky, the entire accumulated evidence of the last year. "You are my partner in everything that matters to me, and I want you to know that I know that. Not just that I love you, though I do more than I know how to say cleanly, but that I see you, the whole of you. Everything you brought here, and everything you've built here, and everything you're going to build." He paused. "I see it clearly, and it is the greatest thing on this land." Clara's jaw was working. She pressed her lips together and looked at the cattle for a moment, gathering herself, and then she looked back at him with eyes that were bright and clear and entirely present. "I was afraid," she said, "coming here. I didn't say it then, and I'm saying it now. I was afraid that I would arrive and be tolerated, that I would be useful and overlooked, that I would spend my life being the person who fixed things for someone who never fully saw me." She paused. "That has happened to me before, in smaller ways. It was what I was most afraid of." He held her gaze. "And," he said. "And I was wrong to be afraid of it here," she said. "You see me. You've been seeing me since before you admitted you were seeing me, which was its own kind of proof." She looked at him with everything she had unguarded and certain and completely clear. "This is home. You are home. This land is mine the way it's yours, and I will fight for it and work for it and grow old on it, and that is not a concession or a compromise. It is exactly what I want." He stepped forward, and she met him, and he held her face in his two ranchers' hands, and she held his arms, and they stood in the middle of the south pasture, with 34 cattle moving around them in the spring morning, and everything that had been broken in the year before she arrived, and everything that had been rebuilt in the year she had been here, all present at once, all accounted for, all included in the moment. He kissed her. She kissed him back. And that was that. In May, Ruth Hale came out to the ranch 3 times in a row to ask Clara about soil chemistry and water systems. And Clara lent her 4 books and said she'd answer any questions that came from reading them. Ruth read all 4 in 2 weeks. In June, Gerald Cross told 3 separate people that Clara Caldwell was the reason the Caldwell operation had turned around, and he said it with the directness of a man correcting the public record, which was what it was. In July, May Patterson told Dorothea Price that the Valley had gotten lucky the day that woman stepped off the train, and Dorothea agreed, and neither of them said anything else about it because some truths don't require elaboration. Tom Haskell was formally investigated by the Territorial Land Office that summer. He did not recover the Morrison land. He did not acquire Caldwell Ranch. He did not build his water empire in this valley on the bones of other people's failed operations. The investigation was thorough and slow and entirely real, and its outcome was the outcome that a pattern documented by a woman with a brown notebook and a sense of justice always intended to produce. By August, Caldwell Ranch had 39 head of cattle on clean range over clean water with solid fences and a roof that did not move and a kitchen garden that had produced beyond anything Ethan had managed in his best prior year and a set of account books that showed for the first time in 4 years a positive balance. Not large, not comfortable yet, but real and growing and moving in the right direction with a momentum that had been built from nothing by 2 people who had decided together that the work was worth doing. Ethan stood on the porch one August morning before the heat of the day arrived and looked at his father's land. He looked at the fence lines and the range and the cattle and the creek channel and the barn with its solid roof and the garden that Clara had made out of a neglected plot of ground by paying it the attention it had been waiting for. He heard the door behind him. Clara came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one and stood beside him and looked at the same thing he was looking at. They stood there for a while without speaking. Then Clara said, "The north section grass is coming in thicker than last year." "I saw that," he said. "We might be able to add another 4 animals next spring without stressing the range." "I was thinking 5, he said. She glanced at him. "5 is aggressive." "You said 38 by summer," he said. "We have 39. She pressed her lips together in the expression that was her version of conceding a point she was pleased to concede. 5, she said. "Possibly." He looked at her. She was looking at the range, with the expression he had come to understand was her most honest face. The focused, forward-looking attention of a woman who was entirely where she intended to be, working towards something she had chosen with her whole self. She had arrived unwanted on a platform in a small town in Montana Territory in the summer of 1882, carrying a battered suitcase and a brown notebook and the entire inheritance of a grandmother who had taught her to see what others overlooked. She had been laughed at and evaluated and underestimated by almost everyone who saw her step off that train. She had saved the cattle. She had secured the land. She had documented the threat and dismantled it methodically. She had climbed a roof in the wind alone and come down and gone back to work. She had held her ground in front of the man who wanted to take the ranch and in front of every smaller version of that man who appeared in different forms throughout the year. She had learned this land the way she learned everything, through honest-looking patient work and the refusal to be talked out of what she knew. She had made this place into a home, not for Ethan's sake, for her own, which meant it was real. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side with the ease of something that had always been going to happen, and they stood on the porch of a living ranch in the August morning and looked at everything they had made together. The woman who arrived unwanted had become the reason the ranch survived. The bride nobody expected had become the person without whom nothing on this land would have been possible. And she had done it the only way anything lasting ever gets done, not through luck, not through a single dramatic moment, but through the steady, honest, unrelenting work of a woman who saw clearly, acted precisely, and never once stopped believing that the broken thing in front of her was worth saving. The land was alive. Ethan Caldwell was alive. And Clara, who had come from nowhere with nothing but a notebook and everything her grandmother had given her, was exactly